In the quiet heart of Europe, long before the deserts of New Mexico would blaze with unnatural fire, before steel towers and grapefruit-sized cores would alter human destiny, there were only whispers. Whispers of something hidden within the very heart of matter itself, the atom. The year was 1938. The world teetered on the edge of another great conflict. The shadows of war stretched across Europe, and in Germany, under the weight of Adolf Hitler's tightening grip, a discovery was made that would ripple outward like a stone dropped in water. It began in a Berlin laboratory with two German chemists, Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann. They were performing experiments on uranium, a heavy element that seemed at the time unlikely to change history. Their work was methodical, cautious, careful. They bombarded uranium with neutrons, expecting one set of results but finding something entirely different. What emerged from their test tubes was not uranium, but barium, a lighter element that had no business being there. At first, the chemists were puzzled. What had gone wrong? Had they made a mistake in the laboratory, or was something more mysterious taking place? It was a friend of theirs, the physicist Lise Meitner, who grasped the significance of what had happened. A woman of extraordinary brilliance, yet exiled by Nazi Germany because of her Jewish heritage, Meitner realized the truth. Hahn and Strassmann had split the nucleus of the uranium atom. The impossible had been achieved. A single atom had been broken apart. Meitner gave the process a name that would echo through history: fission. Fission was not just another scientific curiosity. It was a revelation. For centuries, matter had been thought of as solid, indivisible, immutable. To split the nucleus of an atom was to tear open the very heart of nature, to reveal the binding forces that held the universe together. And when those forces were released, they came with a burst of energy unlike anything the world had ever known. It was Albert Einstein's famous equation, E=mc², that explained it. A little bit of matter, when converted entirely into energy, could unleash unimaginable power. And here, at last, was the key. Out of a small quantity of uranium, there could come a flood of energy enough to destroy, enough to change the destiny of nations. The timing could not have been more dangerous. Nazi Germany was rearming. Hitler's ambitions were stretching beyond his borders. Already he had annexed Austria and was looking hungrily toward Poland and the rest of Europe. The thought that Hitler's Germany might obtain a weapon of unthinkable power sent chills through the international community of scientists. Across the globe, physicists began to talk in hushed voices. The news spread quickly through their circles. Fission was real, and it might be possible to build a bomb. At first, it was an idea almost too enormous to grasp. Could you really take a handful of uranium, split its atoms, and release energy powerful enough to flatten a city? The very scale of it seemed absurd, like a nightmare conjured from fevered imagination. And yet, the math was clear. The physics was undeniable. If a chain reaction could be achieved, one atom splitting another, and another, in a cascading fire, the energy could indeed rival that of the sunday. In the cafes of Paris, in the lecture halls of Cambridge, in the laboratories of America, the conversations grew more urgent. Something had changed in the world, though few outside the scientific community could sense it yet. A new era had been born, and it was already cloaked in secrecy. One man, more than most, felt the urgency. Leo Szilard, a Hungarian physicist, had long been haunted by the idea of chain reactions. He understood, perhaps earlier than anyone, that this discovery in Germany was no small matter. To Szilard, the implications were terrifying. If Hitler's scientists pursued this discovery, they could forge a weapon beyond imagination, one that could bring entire nations to their knees. Szilard resolved that something must be done, but he was not famous. His name carried little weight outside the scientific community. To sound the alarm, he needed someone who could command attention, someone whose voice would be heard at the highest levels of government. And so he turned to Albert Einstein. Einstein, by this time, was already one of the most famous men on Earth. His theory of relativity had reshaped modern physics. His wild hair and thoughtful eyes had become the very image of genius. Though he was living quietly in America, having fled Nazi Germany, his name still carried a resonance that no politician could ignore. Szilard drafted a letter. It was a warning, a stark and urgent message about the possibility of nuclear weapons and the danger of letting Nazi Germany develop them first. He asked Einstein to sign it. Einstein hesitated at first. He was a pacifist by nature, deeply uncomfortable with the thought of his science being used for destruction. Yet Szilard convinced him. The threat was too great. The danger of Hitler with an atomic bomb outweighed every moral reservation. And so, in the summer of 1939, a letter signed by Albert Einstein was sent to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The Einstein-Szilard letter was short, but its message was thunderous. It warned that uranium might be turned into a new and powerful weapon. It urged the United States government to take the threat seriously, to begin research before it was too late. For Roosevelt, the timing could not have been more significant. Europe was sliding into war. Just weeks later, Hitler's armies would invade Poland, and World War II would erupt. The letter landed on the president's desk like an omen of things to come. Roosevelt, cautious but pragmatic, took action. He authorized a modest program to investigate uranium research. At first, it was little more than a trickle of funds, a quiet exploration by the Office of Scientific Research and Development. Yet that small beginning would soon swell into the largest scientific and industrial project the world had ever seen. The Manhattan Project had begun, though no one yet knew the name it would bear or the magnitude of its legacy. In those early days, it was still only an idea. The scientists spoke in tentative tones, their voices half in wonder, half in fear. Was it truly possible to build a bomb? Could the theories of fission be harnessed into a weapon? The answer was not yet clear. The challenges were immense. Uranium was rare. The isotope that could sustain a chain reaction, uranium-235, made up less than 1% of all natural uranium. To separate it from the more common uranium-238 would be a monumental task. And then there was the question of design. How could the fuel be assembled quickly enough, with enough density, to sustain an explosion before it blew itself apart? No one had answers yet. Still, the work began. Slowly, quietly, in laboratories and universities, the first calculations were made, the first designs sketched. A revolution was in motion. And always, behind it, the whisper of fear. What if the Germans were ahead? It was this fear, more than anything, that drove the project forward. The knowledge that across the ocean, under the Nazi flag, some of the finest physicists in the world were working. The thought that they might be building the bomb even now kept the Allied scientists awake at night. In truth, Germany's atomic program was never as advanced as feared, but in those uncertain years, no one knew that. To men like Szilard, Oppenheimer, and Groves, the race felt urgent, desperate, absolute. The atom had been split. The genie was out of the bottle. Humanity had taken the first step down a path from which there would be no return. No matter what came later, the laboratories at Los Alamos, the reactors at Hanford, the thunderclap at Trinity, it all began here, with the whispers of the atom, in a Berlin laboratory, with two chemists puzzled over their results, and a physicist in exile who saw what it meant. From that moment on, the world was different. And though most people did not yet realize it, the countdown had already begun. The whispers of the atom did not fade with the passing months. They drifted across continents, carried in letters, in hurried conversations, in the urgent voices of scientists who sensed that the age of discovery had collided with the age of war. The realization that the atom could be split, that its nucleus could be torn apart to release energy greater than anything humankind had ever seen, was not something that could be hidden within the walls of a single laboratory. It spread, quietly, but persistently, across oceans and into the hearts of those who understood its meaning. The world outside those laboratories was trembling. Adolf Hitler had risen to power in Germany. his armies on the move, his speeches echoing across Europe with promises of conquest. One by one, nations fell or bent under his shadow. The Anschluss, the annexation of Austria, had shown how quickly borders could vanish. Munich had revealed how fragile the promises of peace really were. And as war loomed closer, the scientists who knew of fission asked themselves the darkest of questions. What if Hitler's Germany were the first to build the bomb? For Leo Szilard, a restless Hungarian physicist with an imagination that rarely stopped racing, the danger was clear from the very beginning. He pictured in his mind a chain reaction, neutrons multiplying, atoms splitting, a cascade of energy spiraling outward. He saw not a laboratory curiosity, but a weapon. A single device that could level a city, perhaps even end civilizations. And if he could see it, surely German scientists could too. Germany had some of the best physicists in the world, and the discovery of fission had been made on German soil. Szilard was not alone. Other processi, émigrés, men like Edward Teller and Eugene Wigner, had fled Europe to escape Hitler's grasp, and they carried with them both brilliance and fear. They had left behind families, homelands, and old lives, but they had not left behind their knowledge. They gathered in small rooms in America, their accents thick, their urgency greater than ever. Together they shared a conviction: the United States must act first, before the Reich unleashed a weapon too terrible to imagine. They knew that simply sounding an alarm would not be enough. Politicians were busy with other matters. Military leaders thought in terms of tanks and planes. The idea of an atomic bomb might have seemed too abstract, too speculative. So, Szilard conceived of a plan. They would write to the president, to Franklin D. Roosevelt himself, and explain the danger. But who among them could ensure the letter would be taken seriously? Who had the authority, the name, the recognition? There was only one answer: Albert Einstein. Einstein had long since changed the very foundations of physics, but by 1939 he was living quietly in America, far from the turmoil of Europe. He was reluctant to involve himself in politics, but Szilard persuaded him. The moment was too urgent, the risk too grave. So the letter was drafted, calmly outlining the possibilities of fission, warning that Germany might already be working on a bomb. Szilard dictated, Wigner and Teller contributed, and Einstein lent his famous signature. That letter made its way to Roosevelt in October of 1939. At first, the president was cautious, perhaps even skeptical. Yet Roosevelt was not a man to ignore warnings lightly. He passed the matter to his advisors. And slowly, quietly, the first small steps were taken. Committees formed, studies were commissioned, and the idea of uranium research gained a foothold. The whispers had begun to stir the machinery of a nation. The storm outside the laboratories grew louder. In September of 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and the world was once more at war. Britain and France declared hostilities, and German armies swept with terrifying speed across Europe. Tanks rolled, planes roared, cities fell under occupation. The roar of war threatened to drown everything else, yet within certain offices and universities, the scientists pressed harder. They urged the United States to act faster, to not let the opportunities slip away. For a while, progress remained slow, the project modest. Funds were limited, interest uneven. Some doubted whether a bomb was even possible. But then came the 7th of December 1941. Japanese aircraft descended upon Pearl Harbor, unleashing fire and devastation, sinking battleships, killing thousands of Americans in a matter of hours. The United States, stunned and furious, entered the war. 4 days later, Hitler declared war on America, binding the conflict into a true global struggle. With that single sequence of events, everything changed. What had once been an experiment, an uncertain project tucked away in universities, now became urgent. It was no longer an abstract possibility. It was a matter of national survival. America would need every weapon, every idea, every ounce of ingenuity to defeat its enemies. If the bomb could be built, it must be built before Germany or Japan managed to do it first. the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, took control of the effort, establishing an office in New York City. Its official name was the Manhattan Engineer District, chosen simply because of where the office was located, yet the bland title hid the vast importance of its mission. Beneath that name, the most ambitious secret project in history began to take shape. The man chosen to lead it was Leslie Richard Groves, a general whose career had been marked not by laboratories but by construction. He had overseen the building of the Pentagon, a project massive in scope, and he had proven himself decisive, demanding, and relentless in pursuit of results. At first, Groves was disappointed with the assignment. He had long hoped for a combat command overseas, a chance to lead men in battle. Instead, he found himself placed in charge of a strange scientific venture involving invisible particles and theoretical physics. Yet Groves was not the kind of man to refuse responsibility. If this was his task, he would master it. He moved quickly, securing a promotion so that scientists would respect his authority. He seized land in Tennessee for factories, arranged for vast supplies of materials, negotiated the highest possible priority for resources. He was determined to build an industrial empire to feed this bomb project, even before a bomb design had been decided upon. But Groves knew he needed more than factories and resources. He needed a scientific leader who could gather the brightest minds, inspire them, and translate theories into practical designs. He needed someone who could manage egos, solve disputes, and keep the focus on the goal. Among the names suggested was that of J. Robert Oppenheimer, a brilliant, complicated physicist with little administrative experience. Oppenheimer was not an obvious choice. His past connections to left-wing politics and his lack of managerial history made many in Washington wary. Yet Groves saw something in him. Oppenheimer could see the whole picture, could explain complex ideas with clarity, and could bring together people who might otherwise drift apart. Against the advice of many, Groves chose him. It was a gamble, but one that would define the entire Manhattan Project. Together, these two men, so different in temperament and background, became the twin pillars of the effort. Groves, the stern military man, demanding discipline and results. Oppenheimer, the visionary scientist, weaving together the minds of theorists, engineers, and chemists. In their uneasy partnership, the storm found its leaders. The project spread across the country like roots of a vast tree. In Oak Ridge, Tennessee, enormous factories rose from the ground, built to separate uranium isotopes through machines that whirred endlessly, producing only tiny amounts at a time. In Hanford, Washington, nuclear reactors were built to create plutonium, a substance new to human experience, born in the heart of artificial stars. And in the mesas of New Mexico, Oppenheimer chose a place called Los Alamos, where behind barbed wire and secrecy, the greatest scientific minds of the age would gather. By 1943, the Manhattan Project was no longer a whisper. It was a storm that spanned the continent, employing hundreds of thousands of people. Most of them did not know the true nature of their work. To them, it was simply the project. They were told only what they needed to know, and even then, only in fragments. Security was strict, secrecy absolute. Few spoke the word bomb. Instead, they called it the gadget, as if softening the word could soften the reality of what they were building. And yet, deep down, many sensed it. Something vast was approaching, something that would alter the course of history. Equations scribbled on chalkboards in Los Alamos were not simply academic exercises. They were stepping stones toward a future no one fully understood. The machinery at Oak Ridge hummed day and night, isolating atoms one by one, each tiny product destined to fuel unimaginable destruction. At Hanford, glowing reactors quietly gave birth to plutonium, a new element that had never before existed in such quantities on Earth. Outside the barbed wire, the world was aflame. Europe burned as German armies pressed their campaigns. The Pacific boiled with battles, islands changing hands at terrible cost. Everywhere, death and ruin spread. And within this global storm, another storm gathered silently, unseen, but no less powerful. Perhaps what is most haunting in hindsight is the quietness with which it all unfolded. 500,000 people worked on the Manhattan Project, yet the world beyond remained unaware. Newspapers carried stories of frontline battles and political decisions, but not of the secret reactors or the uranium plants hidden in valleys and forests. Families prayed for their sons overseas, never imagining that in New Mexico and Tennessee and Washington, new weapons were being fashioned that could end wars in an instant. The storm was gathering, pressing forward, driven by fear of what the enemy might achieve, and by the relentless determination of men like Groves and Oppenheimer. None of them could yet know the full weight of what they were creating, but they all felt its gravity. The whispers that had begun in Berlin had grown into a thunder that rolled across America. The storm was here, and soon it would break. High in the mountains of New Mexico, where mesas rise like ancient stone altars and pine forests whisper in the wind, a secret world was being born. The land was remote, almost otherworldly, a place where silence seemed to stretch across the horizon, broken only by the cry of birds or the rustle of leaves. For centuries, the region had belonged to the natural world alone, a quiet refuge where the sky was immense and the stars burned brightly in the desert nights. And it was here, upon these mesas, that the Manhattan Project would create a city unlike any other, a city that existed not on maps but in secrecy, a place that would come to be known simply as Los Alamos. Robert Oppenheimer had chosen it, the physicist who had read Sanskrit and poetry as easily as equations, who loved the landscape of the American West with its dry winds and endless skies, had seen this mesa before. Years earlier he had ridden horses through its trails, gazed at the sun setting over its cliffs, breathed in the thin air of its high plateau. When the need arose for a laboratory hidden from prying eyes, Oppenheimer remembered this place. It was isolated, with only a single narrow road leading in, easy to guard, and easier still to keep from the knowledge of the outside world. And yet, despite its remoteness, it was not barren. There was enough water to sustain a community, enough space to build laboratories and housing. It was, he told General Groves, the perfect site. And so the decision was made. The government acquired the land, evicting those who had lived there before, including the staff and students of a small private boys' school. Overnight, the mesas became a fortress of secrecy. Barbed wire went up, gates were built, guards were stationed. Officially, Los Alamos did not exist. On paper, it was referred to as Site Y, a bland designation that revealed nothing. To the scientists and families who moved there, it was simply the hill. The people who arrived at Los Alamos found themselves in a strange new life. One day they had been professors, graduate students, engineers, or technicians in universities and laboratories across America. The next, they were passengers on trains bound for New Mexico, given only vague instructions, told to say little to anyone about where they were going or what they would be doing. Some arrived with excitement, others with hesitation, but all of them entered a world unlike anything they had known. The first impression was often one of desolation. The mesas were beautiful, yes, but they were also harsh, their isolation complete. There were few comforts at first. Families lived in small, hastily constructed houses or in converted buildings from the old boys' school. Muddy roads wound between barracks and laboratories. Water was sometimes scarce, and the winters bit hard with their icy winds. Scientists who had been used to the comforts of university towns found themselves chopping wood for stoves, trudging through snow, or dealing with leaky roofs. One physicist remarked that when you turned on the tap, worms might come out as often as water. And yet, despite the hardships, there was a sense of adventure, almost of pioneer spirit. This was not merely another laboratory, it was something greater, something wrapped in secrecy and purpose. Everyone who lived on the hill knew they were part of something extraordinary, even if they did not fully understand it. Security was absolute. Scientists knew only their part of the project, seldom the whole. Families were forbidden to ask questions, letters were censored, conversations monitored. Children grew up surrounded by guards, barbed wire, and rules that reminded them daily that their home was a secret. Oppenheimer, now the director of Los Alamos, moved through this strange new city with quiet intensity. He was not a soldier, nor was he an administrator by training, yet somehow he became the soul of the place. His sharp eyes, his thoughtful words, his ability to listen and inspire made him the center around which everything revolved. Scientists, who might have scoffed at military authority, found themselves drawn to Oppenheimer. He spoke their language, understood their doubts, and reminded them of the purpose that bound them together. Groves, for his part, oversaw everything with military precision. Where Oppenheimer charmed, Groves commanded. He worried about security, about timetables, about costs and priorities. He demanded results, pressed for speed, and tolerated no delay. Together, the general and the scientist formed an unlikely partnership, one driven by tension, yet bound by necessity. They needed each other. Groves could build the factories, gather the resources, and marshal the power of government. Oppenheimer could harness the minds of the greatest scientists alive. Alone, neither could have succeeded. Together, they drove the project forward. Inside the laboratories, work pressed on with relentless urgency. Chalkboards filled with equations, sheets of paper scattered with sketches of bomb designs, tables crowded with strange devices and instruments. Teams debated the problems of uranium and plutonium, of chain reactions and critical masses. They faced questions never before asked in minis. The history of the world. How do you compress a sphere of plutonium so that it will explode rather than fizzle? How do you shape explosives into perfect symmetry? How do you measure forces so immense that no previous machine could even attempt the task? The scientists argued fiercely, yet behind their arguments lay a shared determination. Many of them had fled Europe. They had seen what Hitler had done, what fascism could unleash. For them, the bomb was not an abstract pursuit. It was a weapon that might be needed to prevent Germany from achieving victory. Others were motivated by curiosity, by the irresistible challenge of solving problems that no one else had ever solved. Some doubted, some worried, but few turned away. The momentum of the project was too great, and the call of history too insistent. Life in Los Alamos developed its own peculiar rhythm. Days were consumed with calculations, experiments, and conferences. Evenings brought gatherings where young men and women, most of them in their 20s, tried to carve out moments of normal life. There were parties, often with punch spiked by laboratory alcohol. There were dances, hikes into the mountains, and games played in the shadows of barbed wire fences. Children rode their bicycles on dirt paths, unaware of the great secret their parents guarded. But always the secrecy loomed. Letters sent to relatives carried no hint of what was happening on the hill. Visitors were rare, and when they came, they were escorted carefully. The bomb itself was never mentioned by name. Instead, it was always the gadget, a word that made the unthinkable seem almost playful, as though it were nothing more than a piece of clever machinery. As the months passed, the scale of what was being attempted grew clearer. Uranium, so rare and difficult to separate, would produce at most one usable bomb. Plutonium, created in reactors at Hanford, offered a faster path, but it presented its own terrible difficulties. Early designs failed, tests fizzled, and entire approaches had to be abandoned. Oppenheimer himself considered resigning at one point, despairing that plutonium would never yield a workable weapon. Yet the pressure of the war, the urgency of their mission, and the sheer determination of those involved drove them onward. The laboratories became a crucible, forging new ideas day by day. Implosion replaced the gun-type design for plutonium, and with it came an entirely new set of challenges. The precision required was staggering. Explosives had to be arranged in perfect symmetry, detonated at precisely the same instant, to compress the plutonium core into critical mass. No one had ever done such a thing. But failure was not an option. They built new groups, reorganized teams, brought in experts like George Kistiakowsky to tackle the problems. Slowly, painfully, the pieces began to fall into place. Meanwhile, outside Los Alamos, the world pressed on. The war in Europe raged, battles consuming cities, soldiers falling by the thousands. In the Pacific, the struggle against Japan grew fiercer, with islands becoming graveyards of men and machines. News of casualties and victories filtered through the hill, reminding everyone why they labored so intensely. Though the war seemed far away in the quiet mountains, it was always present in their minds. Los Alamos was a paradox. It was both a city of intense intellectual brilliance and a place of mundane struggles. Scientists who unlocked the secrets of the universe spent their evenings fixing leaky roofs, chopping wood, or trying to keep warm in the thin desert air. Families lived ordinary lives in extraordinary circumstances, children going to school in buildings that were guarded as if they held national treasures. Life was normal, and yet nothing was normal. And above it all hung the knowledge that if they succeeded, the world would never be the same. The secret city was not building a bridge, or a factory, or even a weapon in the ordinary gives of its sense. They were creating something entirely new, something that had never existed before in human hands. They were building a device that could change the course of history in a single flash of light. By 1944, the community on the hill had grown into thousands. Scientists from across America, and even from Britain and Canada, joined the effort. Soldiers patrolled the fences, while clerks, technicians, and machinists filled the workshops. It had become a small city, self-contained, secret, and focused on one purpose. The outside world did not know it existed, but inside its barbed wire, history was being written with every equation, every experiment, every sleepless night. The secret city of Los Alamos was alive, humming with purpose, its people bound together by secrecy and by the weight of the task they carried. They could not yet know how their work would end, what their gadget would unleash upon the world. But already the path was set, and the world outside would soon be forever changed by what was happening on that remote mesa in New Mexico. Far from the mesas of New Mexico, hidden among the hills of Tennessee and along the lonely stretches of the Columbia River in Washington, two other secret worlds were rising. If Los Alamos was the brain of the Manhattan Project, these were its beating heart and its lungs, vast industrial complexes whose scale dwarfed anything the scientists on the hill could imagine. Here, entire cities were conjured almost overnight, born of government orders and military urgency, built to wrest from the earth, and from the atom, the materials that would feed the gadget. They were places where thousands of men and women labored without knowing why, where factories the size of small towns hummed with strange new machines, and where secrecy cloaked every action. These were the hidden cities of Oak Ridge and Hanford, and without them, the project would have been nothing but theory. It began with uranium. From the soil, from the mines of Oak Ridge, Africa, came vast shipments of ore, packed in barrels and transported under guard to American shores. The problem was simple in concept yet monumental in practice. Natural uranium contained only a fraction of the isotope needed for a bomb, uranium-235. Less than 1% of the ore was the precious isotope, the rest the heavier uranium-238. Separating them was like trying to sift dust from dust, particles indistinguishable in chemistry, bound together by nature. The challenge was not whether it could be done, but how to do it on a scale so vast that enough fuel could be gathered for war. General Leslie Groves moved quickly. In Oak Ridge, Tennessee, he seized 56,000 acres of farmland, displacing families who had lived there for generations. The land, once quiet with fields and barns, was soon alive with bulldozers, cranes, and endless streams of workers. Roads appeared where only dirt paths had wound before. Entire neighborhoods were erected in weeks, rows of wooden houses, dormitories, and schools. From the ground, rose enormous factory buildings, windowless, sprawling, with walls of steel and concrete. Oak Ridge became a city, but a city unlike any other, one whose purpose even its residents were forbidden to know. At its peak, more than 75,000 people would live and work there, yet to the outside world it was invisible. Mail was addressed only to the Clinton Engineer Works. Inside the plants, workers performed repetitive tasks, turning knobs, checking gauges, recording numbers, never fully aware of what their labor achieved. Some worked at machines that used magnets to bend the paths of uranium ions. Others watched miles of piping where gases flowed under careful control. To many, it seemed meaningless, a job like any other, though with stricter rules and tighter security. And yet, day by day, gram by gram, uranium-235 was being separated, slowly accumulating into a substance unlike any the world had seen. In Oak Ridge, the WW2 strangeness of the place was part of everyday life. Guards stood at checkpoints, ID badges had to be shown at every turn. Conversations about work were forbidden, even at the dinner table. Housewives shopping for groceries knew better than to ask their neighbors what shifts they worked or what machines they tended. It was understood that silence was part of survival, and silence was what kept the city safe. Children played in the muddy streets. Schools taught lessons without ever mentioning the purpose of their parents' labor, and yet all lived under the invisible weight of secrecy. If Oak Ridge was the realm of uranium, then Hanford, in Washington state, was the kingdom of plutonium. There, along the wide and solitary Columbia River, the government took over hundreds of square miles of land, displacing Native American tribes and small farming communities. The river ran cold and strong, its waters soon to be diverted into cooling systems for the most dangerous machines ever built. At Hanford rose the nuclear reactors, massive concrete fortresses designed to create a new element, one that did not exist naturally on Earth. Inside their cores, uranium would be bombarded with neutrons, transmuted into plutonium, which could then be extracted and refined. The reactors were immense, their graphite piles stretching in dark silence, pierced by channels that carried fuel rods. Water from the Columbia flowed endlessly through them, carrying away the intense heat of reactions that no human eye could see, but whose power was greater than anything imagined before. Around the reactors rose chemical separation plants, vast buildings where the plutonium would be dissolved from irradiated fuel, then purified, gram by precious gram, into metallic form. The scale was staggering. Hanford became a city of thousands, its workers living in hastily built barracks, its streets filled with buses and trucks carrying shift after shift of laborers. Life at Hanford, as at Oak Ridge, was shrouded in secrecy. Workers wore masks and protective gear, handling substances that glowed faintly in the dark or steamed with invisible danger. Few understood the risks. Many thought only of their paychecks, of their families, of the promise that their work, though mysterious, would help win the war. The atmosphere was one of urgency, of ceaseless construction and effort, where mistakes were costly but where delays could not be tolerated. The landscape itself bore witness to the transformation. Where once orchards had blossomed, now smokestacks and cooling towers rose. The hum of machinery replaced the sound of wind through fields. The night sky glowed faintly with the lights of an industrial complex that officially did not exist. And yet it was here, in this remote corner of Washington, that the fuel for one of the deadliest weapons of all time was being created. For Groves, Oak Ridge, and Hanford were triumphs of organization and willpower. They were monuments to secrecy, speed, and scale. In less than 2 years, he had conjured entire cities from the ground, filled them with tens of thousands of workers, and set into motion processes that stretched the boundaries of science and engineering. The costs were immense, the risks staggering, yet the momentum was unstoppable. Back at Los Alamos, Oppenheimer and his scientists waited anxiously for the results of this colossal effort. The equations on their chalkboards, the models in their laboratories, All depended upon the flow of enriched uranium and purified plutonium from these distant cities. Without Oak Ridge and Hanford, there would be no bomb to design, no gadget to test. Every calculation made on the hill, every design sketched in the desert air, rested upon the unseen labor of those in Tennessee and Washington who knew not what they built. And so, the three worlds, the hill in New Mexico, the secret city of Oak Ridge, and the fortress of Hanford, were bound together in silence. Each played its role, each moved forward under the cloak of war and secrecy, each step carrying humanity closer to a threshold that could never be uncrossed. The cities of atoms, born of fear and necessity, grew into living testaments of what human ingenuity and determination could achieve, and what human ambition and desperation could demand. Their workers would never forget the strangeness of their days, the endless lines for buses, the clatter of machinery that never ceased, the knowledge that they lived in places that were not meant to exist. And when, at last, the world learned of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, those who had lived behind the fences of Oak Ridge and Hanford would understand, with awe and dread, what their silence and labor had wrought. The Manhattan Project, for all its secret cities, its armies of laborers, its reactors and machines, was not only a tale of science or engineering, it was also a tale of two men so different in upbringing, in temperament, in outlook, that their collaboration seemed improbable, almost impossible. And yet, it was their uneasy partnership, their peculiar bond of respect and friction, that gave the bomb its shape. One was a soldier, hardened by command, impatient, practical, always measuring men and resources in terms of efficiency. The other was a dreamer, a scholar of the cosmos, a man who spoke in poetry as much as in physics, who loved ideas as much as equations. Together, General Leslie Groves and Robert Oppenheimer became the twin architects of the atomic age. Without either, the Manhattan Project might have unraveled. General Leslie Richard Groves was a man of iron purpose. He had overseen the construction of the Pentagon, a building so immense it had seemed impossible, yet he had delivered it on time, under pressure, with a ruthlessness that left no room for excuses. He was the son of a military chaplain, raised in discipline and order, taught to believe in the virtue of command. He was large, heavy-set, his jaw firm, his temper quick, his authority unquestionable. To those under his watch, he could seem domineering, a figure carved from stone, impossible to sway. But beneath that roughness lay an extraordinary gift for logistics, an instinct for seeing not only the task at hand, but the hundreds of unseen tasks that lay behind it. He was not a man of science, but he knew how to build empires of industry, and he knew how to keep secrets. Robert Oppenheimer was everything Groves was not. Born into privilege, raised in New York's circles of wealth and art, he had been educated in the finest schools. He spoke several languages, read poetry in the original, quoted the Bhagavad Gita and John Donne with equal ease. Thin, intense, with piercing eyes, he carried with him an air of fragility, as though the weight of his thoughts pressed heavily upon his frame. Students adored him, drawn to his brilliance and his restless mind. Colleagues admired his insight, even as they questioned his practicality. He had never managed anything larger than a classroom. He had never built a machine, never overseen an army of workers. To place him at the head of the most ambitious scientific endeavor in history was, to many, madness. And yet, when Groves met Oppenheimer, he saw something that others missed. In the young physicist's quick explanations, in his ability to weave the threads of theory into a vision of reality, Groves recognized the rarest of gifts, the power to unify, to inspire, to translate complexity into action. Oppenheimer spoke with clarity and respect, treating Groves not as a blundering soldier but as a partner, and Groves, in turn, was dazzled. Against the advice of security officers who distrusted Oppenheimer for his left-leaning politics, against the doubts of scientists who thought him unsuited to command, Groves made his choice. He would appoint Oppenheimer to lead the laboratory at Los Alamos. It was a gamble. Oppenheimer had no record of leadership. He was surrounded by whispers. His wife, his wife, brother, his friends, all linked in some way to communist movements. In another time, in another place, such associations would have ended his chances. But Groves was determined. He told his superiors bluntly, "Oppenheimer is my man." With that decision, the unlikely alliance was forged. From the beginning, the two men were bound together in a strange rhythm of conflict and trust. Groves demanded results, deadlines, efficiency. He expected his scientists to work like soldiers, to follow orders without hesitation. Oppenheimer, meanwhile, nurtured an atmosphere of debate, of ideas shared freely, of minds exploring possibilities without fear. His laboratory on the mesa became a place where some of the greatest thinkers of the age, Feynman, Teller, Bethe, Segre, could argue late into the night, scribbling equations, sketching diagrams, pacing under the stars. To Groves, this seemed dangerously chaotic, but he recognized that it was also productive. He gave Oppenheimer space, even as he tightened security and reminded everyone of the stakes. There were clashes, of course. Groves bristled at the scientist's habit of questioning authority. He had no patience for what he saw as intellectual vanity. Oppenheimer, in turn, resented the military's rigid secrecy, which stifled collaboration. Yet in their friction, a balance emerged. Oppenheimer persuaded Groves to allow freer exchanges among the scientists, knowing that ideas could not thrive in isolation. Groves insisted on discipline, on structure, ensuring that creativity did not dissolve into chaos. Slowly, the Hill began to function not only as a collection of brilliant individuals, but as a unified force. Their partnership was not one of friendship, but of necessity, respect, and an odd kind of admiration. Groves saw in Oppenheimer a mind unlike any he had known, a man who could grasp the vastness of the project as a whole and yet dwell on the minutest detail of a calculation. Oppenheimer saw in Groves a determination that matched his own, a capacity to move mountains, to conjure entire cities of industry, to shield the project from political interference. Together, they formed a dyad, the general and the genius, each supplying what the other lacked. For Oppenheimer, the weight was immense. He knew what was being built. He knew that his brilliance, his leadership, was pulling the world toward a precipice from which there would be no return. He carried that knowledge with a mixture of pride and dread. At night, he walked the mesas, smoking his cigarette, staring at the stars, reciting verses of Donne, "Batter my heart," three-personed God. His colleagues saw in him both inspiration and melancholy, a man burning with vision, but shadowed by foreboding. For Groves, the weight was different. He did not dwell on the philosophical. He thought of logistics, of deadlines, of the war that consumed the world. His focus was simple: to deliver a weapon before the enemy could. To him, the bomb was a task, a mission, to be completed with efficiency. He could admire Oppenheimer's brilliance without sharing his doubts. He could drive the scientists harder without pausing to consider the moral abyss into which they peered. And yet, when the two men met, when they sat across from each other, something passed between them, an unspoken acknowledgement that each was indispensable to the other. Without Groves, Oppenheimer would have been a brilliant but isolated thinker, lost in equations. Without Oppenheimer, Groves would have been a commander with factories but no weapon. Together, they became the axis around which the Manhattan Project turned. At Los Alamos, their presence was felt in every corridor. When Groves visited, his heavy steps and stern gaze sent ripples of discipline through the laboratories. When Oppenheimer entered a room, conversation quickened, ideas sparked, energy flowed. Scientists felt themselves drawn into his orbit, compelled to work harder, to think deeper. Groves provided the resources, the authority, the shield against Washington. Oppenheimer provided the vision, the spark, the sense of destiny. As the months passed, the bond deepened. They quarreled, yes, over details, over deadlines, over security and secrecy, but always, after the storm, they returned to their shared purpose. Both knew that failure was unthinkable. Both knew that the project had consumed billions, had uprooted cities, had harnessed the labor of hundreds of thousands. Both knew that history itself was moving through their hands. In time, others would speak of their relationship with awe and puzzlement. How had Groves chosen Oppenheimer, this unlikely scholar, this delicate man with communist friends? How had Oppenheimer endured Groves, this iron general with little patience for doubt? And yet, the answer lay in the results. For all their differences, they had built together a machine of unimaginable power, a machine that would change the world. Late at night, when the desert wind blew cold, Oppenheimer might have wondered what path he had taken, whether his brilliance had been bent to purposes beyond his control. Groves, at the same hour, might have reviewed schedules and shipments, satisfied that the work advanced, that the goal approached. Two men, two worlds, bound together, steering humanity toward its fateful dawn. Thus the Manhattan Project was not only the story of science or secrecy, of factories or reactors, it was the story of a partnership that seemed impossible yet proved essential. The genius and the general dreamer and commander stood at the heart of it all, their differences fused into a single force. And because of them, the atom, once only a whisper in the minds of physicists, became the roar that shook the world. The dawn of the atomic age was not just the product of equations scribbled on chalkboards or the vast machinery of Oak Ridge and Hanford. It was also the result of design, the careful shaping of theory into form, of abstract physics into tangible devices. At Los Alamos, behind locked doors and watchful guards, two bombs were born, two siblings of destruction. They would be given deceptively simple names, Little Boy and Fat Man. Yet behind those names lay years of struggle, setbacks, arguments, breakthroughs, and long nights where some of the greatest minds of the 20th century bent all their powers toward the most terrible of goals. The first design seemed almost straightforward, at least in principle. To make a bomb with uranium-235, one needed only to bring two subcritical pieces together quickly enough that they would form a critical mass. Once joined, the chain reaction would race through the material, releasing a surge of energy that no explosive on Earth had ever equaled. This concept was known as the gun-type design, for the mechanism resembled a cannon. One piece of uranium would be fired down a barrel into another, slamming together, becoming critical in an instant. It was a crude vision, almost childishly simple, but in its simplicity lay its reliability. The scientists had no real doubts that it would work. This was the bomb that came to be called Little Boy. Slender, elongated, a cylinder of steel more than 10 feet long, it housed within its shell the painstakingly separated uranium from Oak Ridge. Every gram of that uranium had been wrestled from mountains of ore, teased out of isotopes through calotrons, gaseous diffusion, and the tireless work of tens of thousands who never knew what they were making. All of it, all that unimaginable labor, was funneled into a single device, into a chamber that would one day be bolted into the belly of a B-29 bomber. The design of Little Boy was so certain that it was never tested. To build even one uranium bomb required such immense resources that there was simply no material to spare. And besides, the scientists were confident. The mathematics were clear, the mechanism simple. Once the uranium came together, the explosion would be inevitable. The danger, if anything, lay in accidental detonation, in the possibility that the bomb might go off during handling, during loading, even during flight. Elaborate safety measures were devised, but in the end, the weapon was a brute force device, its reliability taken for granted. If Little Boy was straightforward, its brother was anything but. The bomb that would be called Fat Man was born from plutonium, the man-made element created in the reactors of Hanford. At first, the scientists had hoped to use the same gun-type design. Two pieces of plutonium would be slammed together, just as with uranium. But in 1944 came the devastating discovery. The plutonium from the reactors contained impurities, isotopes that emitted stray neutrons. These stray emissions would cause premature chain reactions, pre-detonations, that would fizzle before the bomb could reach full power. A gun-type plutonium bomb was impossible. The only hope lay in a radically different approach, one that seemed nearly impossible: implosion. Instead of slamming two pieces together, the plutonium would be formed into a sphere, surrounded by high explosives, arranged with exquisite precision. When detonated, the explosives would compress the plutonium inward, squeezing it to a density where it would become critical. It was an inversion of everything familiar, not explosion outward, but implosion inward, and it demanded an engineering perfection that bordered on fantasy. If the explosives did not detonate at exactly the same instant, with symmetry as perfect as the facets of a diamond, the implosion would fail. This challenge consumed Los Alamos. Teams of physicists, chemists, metallurgists, and engineers worked day and night, experimenting with explosives, devising detonators, testing models. They built elaborate arrays of charges around spheres of metal, measuring shock waves with high-speed cameras, recording the tiniest asymmetry. Failure after failure was recorded. Explosions that blew apart mock-ups without producing implosion. Shock waves that met unevenly, leaving gaps and distortions. The problem seemed insoluble, the deadline impossible. Yet slowly, painstakingly, progress was made. New types of detonators were invented, tiny devices that could fire simultaneously to within millionths of a second. New explosives were tested and refined, molded into precise lenses that could bend their blast waves inward. Each experiment brought them closer to the elusive symmetry, and all the while the plutonium from Hanford accumulated, waiting to be shaped into a core, waiting for its cage of explosives to bring it to life. Fat Man, when it was finally assembled, was a strange and bulky creation. Rounded, bulbous, over 10 feet long, but almost as wide as it was tall, it weighed more than 5 tons. Inside its steel casing lay layers upon layers, high explosives arranged in perfect geometry, wiring that carried the signals to fire them, and at the center, the precious plutonium core, smaller than a grapefruit, but more dangerous than all the bombs of the world combined. It was a triumph of desperate ingenuity, a device born not of simplicity, but of the most sophisticated science of its time. And yet, unlike Little Boy, Fat Man could not simply be trusted. The implosion method was too novel, too uncertain. It had to be tested. And so, in the desert of New Mexico, the Trinity test was planned, the first detonation of a nuclear device. It would be Fat Man's design, not Little Boy's, that was tested there. The scientists knew that if implosion failed, then all the plutonium at Hanford would be useless, all the effort wasted. The pressure was unbearable. For Oppenheimer, the two bombs became symbols of his laboratory's duality. Little Boy, simple and inevitable, needed no testing, no innovation. It was brute force. Fat Man, on the other hand, was delicate, temperamental, requiring brilliance, patience, and daring. In Fat Man, Oppenheimer saw the true spirit of Los Alamos, the marriage of theory and experiment, of despair and triumph. And he knew, as did Groves, that Fat Man would become the real measure of their success. As the months turned to weeks and then days, the designs were finalized. Machine shops at Los Alamos buzzed with activity, crafting the parts, shaping the casings, wiring the circuits. Technicians worked in shifts, overseen by scientists who checked every detail, every connection. Security was absolute. No one outside could know, and even within, few could see the whole picture. Only Oppenheimer, Groves, and a handful of others understood fully what was taking shape. And yet, despite the secrecy, there was a strange sense of destiny in the air. The scientists felt it, the soldiers felt it, even the technicians who handled wires and bolts felt it. Something was being born in those laboratories, something that would shake the earth. They did not speak of it openly, but they felt it in the tension of their work, in the way Oppenheimer's eyes burned with intensity, in the way Groves pushed them harder, ever harder. Little Boy and Fat Man. Two names that seemed almost comical, nicknames you might give to children or toys, but in their shells lay the culmination of centuries of science, of years of war, of uncounted sacrifices. They were not toys. They were not children. They were weapons beyond imagination, waiting to be unleashed. And once they were, the world would never again be the same. When at last the designs were complete, when the prototypes were ready, the men of Los Alamos stepped back and looked at what they had created. There was pride, yes, and relief, and awe. But there was also something else, something unspoken that weighed heavily in the desert air. For in the steel of Little Boy and the bulk of Fat Man lay not only victory, but a shadow that would fall across the future of all humankind. The designs of destruction were ready. Now came the question of whether to use them and how the world would look when they had been used. The desert had always been silent. For centuries, winds had swept across its sands, sculpting mesas and canyons, moving grains of dust in endless cycles, indifferent to the lives of men. The Jornada del Muerto, the Journey of the Dead, was a place where history rarely lingered, where even echoes faded quickly. Yet in the summer of 1945, this desert of New Mexico began to breathe differently. Strange trucks rolled over its arid ground. Men in uniforms came and went. Cables were uncoiled across the dust. Towers were raised like unnatural spires against the empty horizon. The desert that had known only stillness was being prepared to witness a new dawn, a dawn not of the sun but of fire conjured by humankind. The test had a name, as though giving it a name would tame it. They called it Trinity. No one is quite sure why Oppenheimer chose the word. Some said it came from a poem by John Donne that haunted him in the quiet hours, a poem about divine fire and the breaking of the heart. Others thought perhaps it was irony, a wry twist to cloak a terrible weapon with a name that spoke of holiness. Whatever its source, the name lingered like a shadow. Trinity, the first atomic explosion in human history. For months the preparations consumed Los Alamos. Fat Man's implosion design had to be proven. The scientists could not gamble on theory alone. Too much was at stake. And so they built the gadget, as they called it. A sphere of steel, wires, and explosives, with a plutonium heart no larger than a grapefruit. On the outside, it looked crude, patched together, as though held by bolts and faith alone. But inside, it was the distilled essence of years of labor, the single device that would reveal whether their terrible design could truly work. Groves oversaw everything with his usual iron discipline. He barked orders, scheduled trucks, demanded reports. He worried about the weather, about the press, about the possibility of catastrophe. Oppenheimer, meanwhile, moved like a man carrying an invisible weight. His thin frame seemed drawn tighter every day, his eyes hollowed by sleepless nights. To some he looked like a prophet, to others a ghost. Yet he remained in command, guiding his scientists, urging them to focus, to perfect, to endure. The tower was built in the desert, 100 feet high, a skeletal structure of steel designed to hold the bomb as if it were some strange fruit ripening in the dry air. Beneath it, instruments were arranged in bunkers miles away. Cameras were prepared, some capable of recording thousands of frames per second. Detectors were placed to measure shock waves, radiation, heat. Every detail was considered. Nothing like this had ever been attempted before, and yet everything had to be done with precision. The desert filled with men who were not usually soldiers. They were scientists, engineers, technicians. They came with notebooks instead of rifles, with equations instead of battle plans. Yet they wore uniforms. They saluted. They followed orders. For here, in this place, science and the military had become one. Some felt pride, others dread, but all were caught in the momentum of the project. Nights in the desert were long. The winds whispered through the tower, carrying with them the faint scent of sage and dust. Men sat in bunkers, smoking, drinking bitter coffee, speaking in low tones about what was to come. Some joked nervously, others fell silent. A few prayed. The gadget waited above them, silent and implacable. its explosives wired with the utmost care, its plutonium core resting within like a dormant heart. The days ticked by. July grew hotter. The scientists tested and retested every circuit, every detonator. George Kistiakowsky, the explosives expert, fussed over the lenses that would shape the blast inward. He worried about bubbles in the castings, about imperfections that could ruin the implosion. Engineers crawled across the tower, tightening bolts, checking wires. Soldiers guarded the perimeter, their rifles gleaming in the sunday. And always, above them, the gadget loomed, its presence undeniable. Rumors spread among the workers. Some wondered if the bomb might ignite the atmosphere itself, setting the sky aflame. Others spoke of the possibility of failure, of a dud that would make them the laughingstock of the world. And some feared success, feared that once the weapon was proven, it could never be contained again. Each man carried his private thoughts, but together they labored, bound by duty, by secrecy, by the gravity of history pressing down upon them. On July 14th, a test of the high explosives went badly, shaking confidence. Kistiakowsky cursed under his breath, his hands trembling as he reviewed the wreckage. Oppenheimer paced, chain-smoking, staring at the desert floor as though searching for answers in the dust. Yet Groves insisted they press forward. There was no turning back. Too much had been invested. Too much depended on this moment. The date was set for July 16th, in the early hours before dawn. The men would gather in bunkers, 5, 10, 20 miles away. They would wait in the dark, listening to radios, waiting for the countdown. The bomb would rise with the sun, or perhaps consume it. No one truly knew. The night before the test, rain fell across the desert. Lightning flashed in the distance, thunder rolling over the mesas. The scientists fretted, fearing the storm would force a delay. Groves refused to yield. He stalked the command center like a restless animal, demanding weather reports, pressing the meteorologists for hope. Finally, as dawn approached, the skies began to clear. The rain slackened, the winds eased. The test would proceed. At 5:30 inches the morning, the countdown began. Men crouched in bunkers, some shielding their eyes with welder's glass, others peering through periscopes. Oppenheimer stood among them, silent, his hands clenched, his face pale. His brother Frank was beside him, nervously shifting his weight. Kistiakowsky clutched his stopwatch. Groves stood rigid, arms folded, as if daring the bomb to defy him. The seconds slipped away. 10, 9, 8. The desert held its breath. 7, 6, 5. Somewhere in the tower, the detonators hummed to life, currents racing through wires. 4, 3, 2. In the core of the gadget, the explosives waited, perfectly aligned, ready to collapse inward with deadly symmetry. 1, 0. A light erupted that no human had ever seen before. It was not the light of fire, nor of lightning, nor of the Sunday. It was a light beyond imagining, searing white at the center, blooming outward into shades of orange, purple, red. The desert was illuminated as though day had come in an instant, shadows stretching miles long. Men gasped, some cried out, some fell silent. The fireball expanded, churning, boiling, a sun born upon the earth. A shockwave raced outward, flattening desert shrubs, rattling bunkers. Heat washed across the land, scorching the sand into glass. Above, a mushroom cloud climbed into the sky, towering, rolling, billowing higher and higher until it seemed to touch the heavens themselves. For a moment, there was only awe. Silence filled the bunkers, as men stared, transfixed, unable to comprehend what they had done. Then came the sound, a roar like the tearing of the world, thunder that seemed to roll on forever. Windows shattered, the ground trembled, and the air was alive with force. In that moment, Oppenheimer later recalled a line from the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." He did not speak it aloud that morning, but the words lived within him. As the terrible light reflected in his glasses, as the glow of the new sun faded from the desert sky, The Trinity test had succeeded. The implosion worked. Fat Man's design was proven. The path ahead was now clear. But as the men dispersed from the desert, as the mushroom cloud drifted into memory, something heavier lingered in the air. They had unleashed a force that could not be recalled, a secret that could not be hidden again. The world had changed in that instant, changed forever. And each man who had stood in the desert that morning carried the knowledge that he had witnessed the birth of a new age. The desert fell silent once more. The winds resumed their endless task of moving sand, covering tracks, erasing footprints. But beneath the silence, the memory of that light remained, etched into the land, etched into the minds of those who had seen it. Trinity was not just a test. It was a beginning and a warning. The desert explosion had proved the unimaginable was possible. The scientists returned from Trinity with ash still on their boots, with the thunder of that blast still ringing in their ears. The generals returned with something colder in their eyes, the certainty that the weapon now existed, that it could be readied, that it could be used. The light of Trinity had faded, but its echo traveled instantly across the corridors of power, across Washington, across the world. President Harry Truman had not seen the explosion with his own eyes. He had not crouched in a bunker. He had not shielded his gaze behind welder's glass. He had not felt the shockwave in his chest. Yet the burden of what came next now rested squarely upon his shoulders. He was a new president, only weeks into the role, after the sudden death of Franklin Roosevelt. He had not been deeply briefed before. The bomb had been a shadowy rumor, an almost mythical project whispered among advisors. Now, suddenly, it was real. The weapon was no longer theory. It was steel and fire, already tested, already alive. The question, as it reached Truman, was simple in its phrasing and impossible in its weight. Should the bomb be used? The war in Europe had ended that spring. Germany lay in ruins. Hitler was dead, the Allies victorious. But in the Pacific, the praised days, war raged on. Japan still resisted, still fought with a ferocity that stunned even seasoned soldiers. Cities had been firebombed, skies filled with the drone of B-29 seconds, yet the empire clung to its defiance. Tokyo burned, and still surrender did not come. Okinawa had been a bloodbath. Tens of thousands of Japanese civilians, thousands of American soldiers, all sacrificed in an inferno of shells and bayonets. And looming ahead was the prospect of an invasion of the Japanese home islands themselves, a campaign that promised to dwarf even Normandy in bloodshed. Military planners spoke of hundreds of thousands of American lives lost, perhaps millions of Japanese. Against this backdrop, the bomb appeared to some as an answer. A terrible answer, yes, but perhaps a quicker one. A way to shock Japan into surrender without the carnage of invasion. Yet to others, the idea was monstrous. To unleash this new weapon, to drop it upon a city, upon civilians, upon flesh and blood, was this victory? Or was it something darker? The debate was tangled, hushed, often unspoken. Scientists who had labored for years on the project now found their consciences stirring. Some drafted petitions, urging that the bomb be demonstrated instead of used, exploded before Japanese observers on an empty island, to show its power without its slaughter. Others feared such a demonstration might fail, leaving America humiliated, emboldening Japan. Still others argued that only real destruction, undeniable and catastrophic, could bring surrender. Leo Szilard, who had once warned of Hitler's bomb, now pleaded for restraint. He circulated a petition among scientists, warning that the use of nuclear weapons on cities would open a door that could never be closed. He believed history would judge them harshly, that the United States would forever carry the stain of having struck first with this terrible new force. But the voices of generals and strategists were louder in Truman's ears. Men like Groves, who had managed every rivet, every shipment of uranium, every guarded secret, spoke firmly of necessity. Men like Secretary of War Henry Stimson laid out the costs of invasion in grim numbers. Men like General Marshall argued the bomb could save lives in the long run, that horror now might spare greater horror later. Truman listened, nodded, smoked his cigarette, and thought of the families who still received telegrams each week, the mothers who still wept over flag-draped coffins. He thought of the Pacific, of young soldiers still falling in jungles and beaches half a world away. He thought of America's exhausted patience for war, and perhaps he thought too of power, of showing the Soviet Union what America now possessed, of shaping the post-war world with fire. On July 26, the Allies issued the Potsdam Declaration: surrender unconditionally, or face prompt and utter destruction. Japan, proud and wounded, refused. They clung to conditions: the survival of the emperor, the preservation of their own trials, the shielding of their homeland from occupation. To Truman, and to many around him, the refusal left little choice. In secret, preparations advanced. On the island of Tinian, the bombers were readied. One bomb of uranium, never tested but trusted to work, was nicknamed Little Boy. Another of plutonium, proven at Trinity, was called Fat Man. Crews drilled, mechanics checked and rechecked bolts and switches. The bombs were assembled with utmost care, guarded by soldiers who scarcely understood the cargo. Back in Washington, Truman weighed his silence. Some historians would later argue he never gave a formal, explicit order, that the machinery of the project rolled forward with such momentum that stopping it would have required active resistance. Others said he understood perfectly and chose not to interfere, allowing events to unfold as planned. Whatever the truth, the decision crystallized: the bomb would be used. And so, in the early hours of day, August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay took off from Tinian, carrying in its belly the first nuclear weapon ever meant for war. The plane rose into the night sky, its engines droning steadily as it crossed the Pacific, heading toward Hiroshima. Truman was at sea, returning from Potsdam, when the message reached him. The bomb had been dropped, the city destroyed. 80,000 souls vanished in moments. A fireball bloomed. A shockwave flattened buildings. Shadows burned into walls where bodies had stood. Hiroshima was a ruin, its people vaporized, charred, broken. Yet still, in Tokyo, surrender did not come. The shock was too great, the disbelief too deep. Leaders argued, hesitated, clung to illusions. And so, 3 days later, Fat Man fell upon Nagasaki. Clouds covered the first target, Kokura, sparing it by chance, and condemning Nagasaki instead. 70,000 more lives ended in a flash, and the world shuddered once again beneath the weight of the atom. Only then did Japan bend, not from one bomb, not from two, but from the combined weight of devastation and the sudden entry of the Soviet Union into the war. The emperor spoke at last, his voice broadcast across the empire, conceding surrender. The war was over. Yet even as Americans celebrated, as confetti filled the streets, as sailors kissed strangers in Times Square, a quieter reckoning began. Some wondered whether the bomb had been truly necessary. Some whispered that Japan had already been seeking ways to surrender, that alternatives had existed. Some feared that by using the weapon, the United States had set a precedent that others would follow. For the scientists who had built it, the victory was hollow. Oppenheimer met with Truman in the White House not long after. He spoke softly, almost trembling. "Mr. President," he said, "I feel I have blood on my hands." Truman, irritated, dismissed him, later calling him a crybaby. But the words lingered. Blood on their hands. The decision had been made. The bombs had been dropped, and history had turned. The atom, once whispered about in Berlin laboratories, once nurtured in secret in the mesas of New Mexico, had now spoken with fire over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And the world, stunned, began to understand that it could never again be the same. The war ended. The guns fell silent. The cities of Europe lay in ruins, their ancient stones blackened by fire, their rivers choked with wreckage. Across the Pacific, the rising sun of Japan had set in smoke and surrender. For the first time in years, humanity could breathe without the sound of bombs above or the tramp of soldiers below. Yet, beneath that breath lay something new, something unsettling, something no one could quite name but everyone could feel. The world had entered a different age, the atomic age. At first, the reactions were raw, mixed, even contradictory. In America, there was celebration. Soldiers were coming home. Factories shifted from tanks and planes back to cars and appliances. Newspapers splashed triumphant headlines. The war is over. The bomb was hailed as the miracle that had ended the bloodshed, the final strike that had saved untold thousands of American lives. People wanted to believe that the sacrifice of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had been not only necessary but merciful. In the streets, confetti fell like snow. In Times Square, sailors and nurses embraced. Families hung banners in their windows. "Welcome home," stitched in bold letters. To them, the bomb was an answer, a gift, perhaps even Providence itself. They looked at photographs of the mushroom cloud and felt awe rather than horror, pride rather than guilt. The press leaned into this feeling, turning the atom into a symbol of victory, a demonstration of American ingenuity, of science harnessed for survival. But among the scientists, the mood was darker. The very men and women who had made the weapon real now lay awake at night, troubled by what they had unleashed. Some had warned, even before the bombings, that to use it on civilians would set a precedent too dangerous to imagine. Now that warning felt heavier. The petitions and protests that had once been whispered in Los Alamos hallways grew louder. In late 1945, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists was founded. Its purpose, not to boast of success, but to warn the world of danger. These scientists, who had touched the core of nature and drawn power from it, feared what would come next. One of them, Albert Einstein, who had once lent his name to the letter that nudged Roosevelt toward the bomb, now spoke openly of his regret. He had not built the weapon himself, but he felt its shadow nonetheless. He warned that the future depended on international cooperation, on restraint, on a recognition that the old ways of war were now suicidal. "The unleashed power of the atom," he said, "has changed everything, save our modes of thinking. Thus we drift toward unparalleled catastrophe." Oppenheimer, too, carried the weight. He had been the architect of Los Alamos, the man who gathered brilliant minds on the mesa, who guided them toward a bomb that once seemed impossible. Yet after the war, he felt estranged from his creation. He quoted scripture to describe what he had seen at Trinity. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." His words haunted those who heard them, for they were not the words of triumph, but of mourning. And beyond America, in the wider world, the bomb was seen through different eyes. To the Japanese survivors, the hibakusha, it was not a symbol of victory but of unbearable suffering. Burn scars twisted their flesh. Invisible radiation poisoned their blood. Shadows on walls marked where loved ones had vanished in a flash. Hiroshima and Nagasaki became names not of defeat but of testimony, reminders of what modern war could mean. In Europe, where cities had already been leveled by firestorms, the bomb was both feared and expected. The Soviet Union, watching carefully, knew what must come next. Stalin was already preparing his scientists, already building his own secret project to match America's new weapon. The balance of power, once measured in armies and fleets, would now be measured in atoms. And so, even in peace, the seeds of the next conflict were sown. The Cold War was beginning, though few yet understood it. In Washington, debates broke out over control of the new weapon. Should it remain in military hands, guarded by generals like Groves, or should it be placed under civilian authority, with oversight from Congress and the people? The Atomic Energy Act of 1946 answered with a compromise, creating the Atomic Energy Commission. Nuclear science would not be the sole property of the Army. It would belong, at least in principle, to the nation. Yet secrecy still reigned, and the public still knew little of the vast laboratories at Hanford, Oak Ridge, and Los Alamos. Meanwhile, tests continued. The bomb was no longer a secret, no longer hidden in deserts and forests. In July 1946, the United States staged Operation Crossroads at Bikini Atoll. For the first time, cameras rolled freely as 2 atomic bombs were detonated, one in the air and one underwater, against a fleet of target ships. Reporters were invited. Observers watched. The explosions were not just experiments, they were theater, a demonstration to the world that the bomb was here to stay. The mushroom clouds rose, the ships sank, and the photographs circled the globe. For many, these tests were thrilling, even reassuring. They suggested that the bomb could be studied, tamed, understood. But for others, the images were terrifying. The bomb had become a spectacle, almost an entertainment, while its consequences remained unspoken. Few mentioned the radioactive contamination that lingered in the lagoon, or the islanders displaced from their homes, or the animals sacrificed aboard the target vessels. The age of atomic publicity had begun. At the same time, the bomb began to seep into culture in stranger ways. Advertisers spoke of the atomic age, attaching the word to cars, to fashions, even to toys. The idea of atomic power carried both menace and wonder. It was destructive, yes, but perhaps it could also be turned to peaceful ends. Electricity, too cheap to meter, cures for diseases, food grown with radiation. Dreams bloomed alongside fears. The bomb, it seemed, was not only a weapon but a symbol of the future. Yet beneath the optimism lay unease. Could such power ever truly be peaceful? Could the atom be split for good without the shadow of destruction? The scientists at Los Alamos had already begun to question, to argue, to divide. Some left the project, returning to their universities, vowing never again to work on weapons. Others stayed, pulled deeper into the labyrinth of military research. The laboratories themselves grew, sprouting like seeds from the Manhattan Project, Argonne in Illinois, Brookhaven in New York, Sandia in New Mexico. The infrastructure of war had become the infrastructure of science, and the momentum was hard to stop. For the ordinary American family, the bomb was both distant and intimate. They saw it in headlines, in films, in government pamphlets that told them how to protect themselves in case of attack. Children ducked under desks, practiced hiding from imaginary blasts. Civil defense posters promised safety in basements, urged preparation of shelters stocked with canned goods. The idea of annihilation entered daily life quietly, as if it were just another chore, another duty. Clean your yard, paint your house, be ready for the bomb. But the truth was harder. Even then, many officials knew that survival was an illusion. Against the fire of hydrogen bombs, still only whispers then. But soon to come, no shelter, no preparation, could guarantee safety. And yet, people clung to the rituals, because the alternative was despair. The world after 1945 was different in ways both grand and subtle. Politics shifted, diplomacy stiffened, alliances formed and hardened. But culture too began to change. Writers, filmmakers, musicians, all grappled with the presence of the atom. The bomb appeared in novels, in movies, in songs. It became part of the collective imagination, a symbol of both fear and fascination. The age of secrecy was giving way to an age of spectacle, but the danger had not lessened. If anything, it had grown. The genie was out of the bottle, and no one knew how to put it back. Nations whispered of treaties, of controls, of bans, but mistrust poisoned every word. The United States had the bomb, and the Soviet Union soon would, and once two nations possessed it, others would follow. The arms race had not yet begun in earnest, but already its shadow stretched across the horizon. For those who remembered the early days, the whispers in Berlin, the letters to Roosevelt, the dusty mesas of Los Alamos, it all felt strangely unreal. What had begun as theory, as curiosity, had become the most powerful force on Earth. The bomb had ended one war, yes, But in doing so, it had begun another, not a war of battles, but a war of nerves, a war of threats, a war in which the enemy might never fire a shot, but could destroy the world all the same. And so the world stepped forward into this new age, uncertain, trembling, caught between triumph and terror. The old world had died with the fireball at Trinity, with the shadows burned into Hiroshima. The new world had been born, and though it carried hope, it also carried the possibility of its own destruction. Humanity had crossed a threshold. There was no going back. War was over, but the bomb was not finished with the world. Far from it. Even as the ashes of Hiroshima and Nagasaki cooled, even as prisoners returned home and nations began to count the cost of 6 years of conflict, the United States prepared something new, not a battle, not an invasion, but a spectacle. It would be called Operation Crossroads, and it would take place on a tiny atoll in the Pacific Ocean called Bikini. It began with a question, one that seemed simple but carried vast consequences. How would the atomic bomb behave against warships? Could fleets survive it? Could navies adapt to a world where one weapon, dropped from a single plane, might erase armadas that had once ruled the seas? Admirals and generals wanted answers, and politicians wanted reassurance. Scientists, too, were eager to measure, to test, to capture data they had missed in the chaos of Japan's surrender. And so, only a year after the world's first wartime atomic detonations, preparations began for a series of peacetime tests. Yet even the word peacetime felt wrong. Nothing about Crossroads was peaceful. It was war by other means. War rehearsed in front of cameras. War turned into demonstration. A fleet of more than 90 target ships was assembled. Battleships, cruisers, carriers, destroyers, submarines, even captured German and Japanese vessels. Once symbols of power, they were now props, waiting to be struck by invisible fire. To stage this theater, the Navy displaced the islanders of Bikini, assuring them they would return soon, though in truth their exile would stretch on for decades. Their home became a laboratory, their lagoon a stage. The Pacific, already scarred by years of battle, would now bear witness to something stranger. Bombs without enemies, explosions without war. The tests were given names: Able and Baker. A third, Charlie, was planned but never completed. Able would be an airburst, like Hiroshima, detonated above the fleet. Baker would be an underwater blast, a plunge of atomic fire into the sea itself. Each was designed not only as an experiment, but as a message, a reminder to the world, and especially to the Soviet Union, that America's new weapon remained unmatched. The preparations were immense. Thousands of sailors, scientists, and engineers converged on the atoll. Cameras were everywhere, more cameras than had ever been gathered for a single event in human history. High-speed lenses, aerial shots, underwater housings. The bomb would not only be tested, it would be filmed, recorded, preserved. This was atomic spectacle, atomic theater, a show staged not just for science, but for the world. On the 1st of July, 1946, the Able test began. A B-29 bomber, cousin to the Enola Gay, carried the device into the sky. Below, the fleet waited silently, empty of human crews, but filled with animals, goats, pigs, rats, placed there to study the effects of radiation on living tissue. Scientists measured, observed, calculated, while journalists stood ready to describe what they saw. The bomb fell, and in a moment, the lagoon became a mirror of Hiroshima. A flash, a fireball, a rising cloud of smoke and flame. Ships reeled in the shockwave, water boiled, and for miles around the sea shuddered. Cameras captured every angle, freezing the moment forever. Yet when the dust cleared, the results surprised many. Only a handful of ships had been sunk. The fleet, battered but afloat, seemed to have survived. Some claimed this was proof the Navy could withstand the bomb, that its power had been exaggerated. Others argued the opposite, that the damage unseen, radiation, contamination, long-term ruin, was the real danger. 3 weeks later came Baker, This time, the bomb was suspended 90 feet underwater, beneath the belly of the target fleet. No one had ever tried such a thing before, and the predictions varied wildly. Some feared the entire lagoon might become a boiling cauldron, vaporizing ships in an instant. Others thought the water might smother the explosion. No one truly knew. At 8:35 inches the morning, Baker was detonated. What followed was unlike anything the world had ever seen. In a fraction of a second, 2 million tons of seawater were thrown upward, forming a column nearly half a mile wide. A great white dome rose from the surface, bulging, glowing, lifting ships into the air, as if they were toys. Then, as gravity reclaimed its prize, the water crashed down, creating a tidal surge nearly 1,000 feet tall. A base surge of mist rolled outward, enveloping the fleet, clinging to metal, saturating everything with radioactive poison. The sight was terrible, mesmerizing, unforgettable. Photographs from Baker remain some of the most haunting images of the atomic age. Not cities reduced to rubble, but water itself turned against creation, the ocean made into a weapon. In the days that followed, sailors tried to reboard the target ships, to measure, to assess. But Geiger counters screamed. Radiation clung to decks, to hulls, to ropes, to every surface. Washing with seawater did nothing. The seawater itself was contaminated. Decontamination seemed impossible. Many ships had to be scuttled, deliberately sunk in deep waters, where their glowing presence could be hidden from the world. The Navy, which had hoped to prove its resilience, instead faced embarrassment. Ships might float, but they were ghosts, untouchable, haunted by invisible fire. The true legacy of Baker was not sunken hulls, but radioactive contamination, a legacy that would echo at Bikini for generations. And yet, despite the horror, Operation Crossroads was framed as progress. The press wrote of spectacle, of science, of America's leadership in the new age. Films were shown to the public. Photographs filled magazines. The bomb was no longer secret, it was spectacle. And with every image, the world was reminded. The atomic weapon was not a rumor, not a myth, but a reality, tested and displayed. For the scientists, Crossroads was a mixture of fascination and dread. The data gathered was invaluable measurements of shock waves, of radiation, of structural damage. But the contamination shocked even them. The ocean had become a laboratory, but it had also become a graveyard. The Bikini Islanders, exiled from their homes, became faith, symbols of sacrifice, their land poisoned in the name of knowledge. And beyond science, the message was clear. The United States had not only built the bomb, it had staged it, displayed it, transformed it into theater. The Soviet Union, watching closely, took note. Within 3 years, they would test their own bomb. The race had begun. Operation Crossroads marked a transition. The Manhattan Project had been born in secrecy, nurtured in silence, delivered in darkness. But now, in the bright light of cameras and headlines, the bomb became part of public life. Its power was no longer hidden. It was a show, a warning, a promise. For the sailors who had been there, for the scientists who had watched, for the islanders who had lost their home, the memories lingered. The flash of light over the lagoon, the column of water blotting out the sky, the taste of salt and radiation in the air, the knowledge that something had been unleashed, not just upon ships, but upon the world itself. Crossroads was not just a test, it was a performance, an announcement, a declaration. The atomic age was here to stay. The bomb was no longer a secret kept in desert mesas. It was the centerpiece of global attention. And though many celebrated, others shuddered, knowing that this was only the beginning. The world had seen what the bomb could do to ships. Soon, it would learn what it could do to nations, to politics, to the very balance of power. The stage had been set, and the play was far from over. The bomb had ended a world war, but it had not brought peace. Instead, it planted something new, something uneasy. Something that grew in shadows and lingered in the background of every conversation, every headline, every political decision. It planted the seeds of the Cold War. The months after Hiroshima and Nagasaki were a strange season. On one hand, the United States stood triumphant. Its armies had won across 2 oceans. Its industries had outproduced all rivals. Its science had cracked open the atom itself. But on the other hand, unease spread through the corridors of power. For even as American leaders spoke of peace, they looked east, across the vastness of Europe, and saw the rising shadow of another giant, the Soviet Union. During the war, Washington and Moscow had been allies, bound together by the necessity of defeating Hitler. American tanks rolled into Europe while Soviet soldiers bled on the Eastern Front, pushing the German army back mile by mile. It had been a brutal marriage of convenience. But once the common enemy was gone, the cracks in that partnership widened into gulfs. The bomb stood at the center of those gulfs. In Washington, some saw it as a shield, a guarantee that no one could challenge America's new leadership. Others saw it as a temptation, a weapon so powerful it might force the Soviets into concessions. And still others saw it as a burden, a dangerous secret that could not be kept forever. At first, President Harry Truman believed the bomb could be managed, even shared, as part of a new international order. There were proposals for global oversight, for inspection systems, for agreements that would control nuclear weapons before they multiplied. The United Nations, freshly born, seemed a possible home for these ideas. The Baruch Plan, presented in 1946, envisioned an international authority that would own and regulate all nuclear material. But the Soviets refused. To them, America's offer sounded like a trap, a demand that they give up the chance to build their own bomb while the United States kept its arsenal ready. Joseph Stalin was not a man to trust easily, and he certainly did not trust the West. The Soviets would not accept any plan that left America holding the only key. And so mistrust hardened. Diplomacy soured. The chance to lock the bomb away, to make it something the world might step back from, slipped through human fingers. Instead, the arms race began to stir. In the meantime, signs of conflict emerged elsewhere. In 1948, the Soviets cut off land routes into West Berlin, hoping to starve the city into submission. America responded with the Berlin airlift, sending planes around the clock to keep the city alive. In Greece and Turkey, in Iran and Korea, in the halls of Eastern Europe, the tug-of-war between Washington and Moscow grew stronger. The world was no longer one of simple enemies and allies. It had split into camps, each watching the other with suspicion, each armed with growing numbers of atomic weapons. For ordinary people, the change came gradually, almost imperceptibly. Headlines spoke of communism, of containment, of Truman's doctrine, of Marshall's plan. But beneath those words lay a simple truth. The bomb had not ended conflict. It had reshaped it. The bomb itself seemed to live in 2 worlds at once. On the one hand, it was a weapon of unspeakable destruction, capable of turning cities into ash in seconds. On the other hand, it was wrapped in symbols of progress and modernity. Atomic energy was promised as the key to a brighter future. Electricity too cheap to meter, new medicines, new technologies. There were atomic exhibitions, atomic fairs, even atomic toys. Children played with glow-in-the-dark gadgets, while their parents watched newsreels of mushroom clouds. It was as if the world had not yet decided whether the atom was angel or demon. But the politicians knew. They had no illusions. To them, the atom was a chess piece, a lever of power, a means of shaping alliances and bending rivals. And in Moscow, Stalin and his scientists were already at work, their own crash program underway, fueled not only by determination but by espionage. For spies had been present in Los Alamos, quiet men who blended into the crowd, who attended seminars, who listened and memorized and passed notes in secret. Klaus Fuchs, the brilliant but quiet German émigré, was one of them. His hands had worked on the very heart of the American bomb. His reports, passed to the Soviets, gave them shortcuts, insights, warnings of mistakes to avoid. Later, it would be said that the Soviet program had been advanced by years thanks to his betrayal. But at the time, no one in Washington suspected the depth of the leaks. And so, in August of 1949, the world shuddered once again. Deep in the Kazakh steppe, the Soviet Union exploded its first atomic bomb. The mushroom cloud rising over the desert was smaller than America's, less sophisticated, but it was real. The monopoly was gone. The age of American nuclear supremacy had lasted only 4 years. When news reached Washington, it fell like a cold wind. Truman announced the test to the public, and panic rippled across the nation. The Soviets had the bomb. They, too, could now erase a city in an instant. And if they had one bomb, soon they would have many. It was in this moment that the true Cold War began. No longer a contest of ideology alone, no longer a battle of propaganda or influence, it became a race of arsenals. Each side built more, each side tested more, each side sought not only to match the other, but to exceed, to dominate, to deter. Mutual suspicion became mutual assured destruction. In the midst of this new reality, the legacy of the Manhattan Project shifted. What had been born as a desperate bid to stop Hitler, what had been finished as a means to end the war with Japan, now became the cornerstone of a global standoff. Scientists who had once thought of themselves as warriors for freedom found themselves questioning, even regretting, what they had unleashed. Some lobbied for arms control, others withdrew in silence. Still others, like Edward Teller, pushed forward eagerly, dreaming of weapons even more powerful, the hydrogen bomb, the fire stolen not just from the atom, but from the very heart of the Sunday. But that is a later story. For now, in the late 1940s and early 1950s, the seeds had been planted. The world was no longer the same. The Cold War had begun, and it would not end for nearly half a century. And through it all, the bomb remained silent, waiting, stored in hangars, hidden in silos, carried on wings that patrolled the skies. It was never used again in anger, but its shadow stretched across decades, across continents, across every life lived in its presence. A shadow born in the laboratories of Berlin, in the deserts of New Mexico, in the secrecy of Los Alamos. A shadow that belonged to all. The desert of Kazakhstan lay silent after the roar of the first Soviet atomic test. A mushroom cloud rose into the sky, carried by winds across empty steppe, a signal that nothing in the world would ever be the same again. The monopoly had ended. America was no longer the sole possessor of atomic fire. Another nation had joined the circle, and with it, the fragile balance of global power shifted. In Washington, the news fell like a hammer. Until that day in August 1949, there had been comfort in the thought that only the United States could wield such a weapon. The bomb was not only a deterrent, but a source of confidence, an anchor to diplomacy, a guarantee that no other nation would dare to challenge American might. But now, that illusion had been shattered. The Soviets had crossed the threshold. The announcement made by President Harry Truman was brief, sober, and shocking. He told the American people that the Soviet Union had successfully exploded a nuclear device. Panic rippled quietly through homes and schools, through factories and offices. If America could destroy Moscow, then Moscow could now destroy New York. The Cold War, which had been simmering as a contest of politics and influence, suddenly burned hotter. It was no longer just words, no longer just ideology. It was a nuclear standoff. Yet within the walls of government and the corridors of scientific debate, the conversation quickly shifted from shock to urgency. If the Soviets had matched America's atomic bomb, then what could America do to maintain an edge? The answer, some argued, lay in going beyond the bomb altogether, in creating something even more powerful, something born not just of fission, but of fusion, the energy of the stars themselves. This dream was not new. Edward Teller, the Hungarian-born physicist with a restless mind and unshakable ambition, had been talking about it since the days of Los Alamos. While Oppenheimer and his colleagues focused on building the practical fission bombs of 1945, Teller had spoken of a greater weapon, the super, a hydrogen bomb that would dwarf even Fat Man and Little Boy. To Teller, fission was just the beginning. Fusion was the future. But the super had remained a vision, a half-formed possibility on chalkboards, not yet a reality. The science was uncertain, the engineering daunting, and the moral questions profound. Many scientists resisted the idea, calling it unnecessary, even dangerous. Robert Oppenheimer himself, after the war, recommended against pursuing a crash program for the hydrogen bomb. He argued that such a weapon, hundreds of times more powerful than those dropped on Japan, would only deepen the arms race and lead to devastation beyond imagining. The debate raged quietly in committees and reports. Some scientists urged restraint, some urged international control. Others, like Teller, insisted that hesitation was folly, that to stop short was to invite vulnerability. And now, with the Soviet bomb tested and confirmed, the arguments of Teller and his allies grew louder. President Truman faced the decision. Could America afford to wait, to hope that the Soviets would not pursue fusion? Could it gamble on goodwill when mistrust was already the defining feature of the age? Truman thought not. In January of 1950, he made the announcement: the United States would develop the hydrogen bomb. The race had entered a new phase, and it would be faster, riskier, and even more terrifying. Even as Truman spoke, the machinery of secrecy and science spun into motion. Laboratories were tasked with solving problems that seemed insurmountable. How could hydrogen, the simplest of elements, be compressed and heated to the point of fusion? How could it be ignited, sustained, and contained long enough to release its unimaginable energy? It was not a single puzzle, but a labyrinth of puzzles, each answer leading to more questions. The scientists themselves were divided. Some left the work entirely, unwilling to be part of it. Others stayed reluctantly, pulled along by duty, by fear of the Soviets, or by the sheer intellectual challenge. Teller, meanwhile, thrived in this new environment. He became the loudest voice, the tireless advocate, the restless dreamer who refused to let the idea fade. His presence drove colleagues to frustration, but it also pushed the program forward. Yet even as Teller pressed for progress, another drama unfolded. The drama of espionage, betrayal, and suspicion. The case of Klaus Fuchs exploded like a thunderclap in early 1950. The quiet, diligent physicist who had worked at Los Alamos, trusted by colleagues, respected for his brilliance, was revealed to be a Soviet spy. His confessions confirmed what some had suspected. The Soviet Union's rapid progress owed not only to its own determination, but to the flow of secrets from within America's most guarded project. The arrest of Fuchs stunned the scientific world. It fed the rising paranoia of the age, stoking fears of hidden communists, of spies lurking in universities, laboratories, even in the halls of government. It poured fuel on the fires of McCarthyism, the sweeping hunt for subversives that soon cast a shadow over American life. And it gave men like Teller and politicians like Louis Strauss the arguments they needed. If the Soviets had spies, if they had already stolen the fission secret, then how long before they stole fusion as well? The only answer, they insisted, was to race ahead, to leave the Soviets behind. And so, the super took shape. Slowly, painfully, through endless experiments, calculations, and failures. The device that finally emerged was not sleek or compact. It was not even truly a bomb in the conventional sense. It was closer to a building, a 70-ton machine of tanks, pipes, and refrigeration systems, built not to be dropped from an airplane, but to prove, once and for all, whether fusion could work on Earth. The Pacific Ocean became its stage. In November of 1952, on the remote atoll of Eniwetok, the device was assembled and prepared. Its codename was Ivy Mike. To those who watched, it looked like an industrial installation rather than a weapon, a testament to the sheer difficulty of making the sun's fire on Earth. Yet beneath its bulk lay the possibility of something new, something beyond anything humanity had ever seen. When the countdown ended and the device ignited, the world changed again. The explosion was unimaginable. 10 megatons of force, over 600 times the power of the bomb that had destroyed Hiroshima. The blast vaporized the island itself, leaving behind a crater more than a mile wide. The mushroom cloud rose higher than any before, stretching 40 miles into the sky. Those who saw it could only stare in awe and horror. The fireball burned brighter than the sun, and the shock wave raced across the ocean, felt hundreds of miles away. It was the birth of the hydrogen age, the confirmation that Teller's dream or nightmare was now reality. News of the test shook the world, though its details remained cloaked in secrecy. Within months, the Soviets responded with their own thermonuclear device. The balance that had briefly tilted back to America tilted once more, and the cycle continued. Each side built more, tested more, refined designs, and sought new ways to deliver these colossal weapons. The bomber fleets grew, sleek new jets designed to carry death across continents. Later, missiles would come, faster and more unstoppable. The arms race was no longer about having a few bombs. It was about having thousands, tens of thousands, enough to obliterate not just enemies but civilization itself. In the midst of all this, the scientists wrestled with their consciences. Some, like Teller, embraced the new reality, seeing it as strength, as deterrence, as survival. Others recoiled, haunted by what they had made. Robert Oppenheimer, the man who had overseen the birth of the atomic bomb, now found himself increasingly at odds with those driving the hydrogen program. His caution, his doubts, his refusal to endorse Teller's vision made him a target. The stage was being set for his fall, a spectacle of hearings and accusations that would strip him of his security clearance and his voice in policy. But that is a story yet to unfold. For now, in the early 1950 seconds, the hydrogen bomb stood as both triumph and terror, a symbol of human genius and human folly alike. The scientists had reached into the very heart of the sun, had harnessed the fire that lights the stars, and had placed it in the service of war. The Soviet bomb had ended one illusion, the illusion of American monopoly. The hydrogen bomb ended another, the illusion of limits. There was, it seemed, no boundary to what humans could make, no ceiling to destruction. And yet, as the mushroom clouds rose higher, as the arsenals multiplied, one question remained unanswered, hanging silently in the air. Could such power ever truly be controlled? The Cold War was only beginning. The hydrogen age had dawned. The seeds of fear and rivalry had blossomed into weapons capable of ending all life. And still, in laboratories and test sites, men and women labored on, solving equations, assembling devices, pushing the frontier forward, never fully knowing whether they were securing peace or preparing the end. The hydrogen bomb had been tested, the fire of the sun drawn down into human hands, and with it the world seemed to teeter on the edge of something new and frightening. But as the mushroom clouds rose higher, another storm was gathering, not in the Pacific skies, but in the meeting rooms of Washington, in whispered conversations, in files locked in cabinets, in suspicions that hardened into accusations. And at the center of that storm was a man once celebrated, once admired, a man whose voice had carried weight among generals and presidents. That man was Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb. Oppenheimer had walked through the desert of New Mexico and seen the first flash of Trinity. He had led Los Alamos, balancing egos, solving problems, pushing science to its limits until the bombs were ready. For his work, he had been hailed as a genius, as a patriot, as the man who had helped win the war. His photograph was on magazine covers, his name spoken with admiration across the world. But after the war, his path grew more complicated. For Oppenheimer was not a man who could silence his conscience, nor could he ignore the moral weight of what had been done. When talk of the hydrogen bomb began to swell, Oppenheimer had resisted. He argued before committees that such a weapon would bring no real security, only an arms race without end. He believed that America already had enough destructive power, and that to chase something hundreds of times more powerful was both reckless and unnecessary. He was not alone in his doubts. Many scientists agreed, fearing what it would mean to unleash such fury. But Oppenheimer's position was not merely scientific, it was also moral, and moral caution in the age of the Cold War was dangerous. For men like Edward Teller and Lewis Strauss, Oppenheimer's hesitation seemed almost betrayal. Teller, eager, restless, convinced that the hydrogen bomb was essential, saw in Oppenheimer an obstacle, a voice that might slow or even halt the program. Strauss, ambitious, sharp-edged, and deeply resentful of slights he felt Oppenheimer had dealt him in the past, carried a personal grudge. To Strauss, Oppenheimer was arrogant, dismissive, a man who needed to be humbled. Together, with others who distrusted Oppenheimer's politics, they began to look for ways to cut him down. The political climate of the time made their task easier. Fear hung heavy in the early 1950 seconds. The Soviet Union had the bomb. The Korean War had erupted, with American and Chinese soldiers clashing in bloody battles. Communist parties were strong in Europe, and in the United States, Senator Joseph McCarthy was launching accusations from podiums, warning that traitors and spies lurked in universities, in Hollywood, even in the State Department itself. To question too loudly, to hesitate at the wrong moment, was to risk being painted with the same brush. Suspicion was in the air, and suspicion had power. Oppenheimer's life, when examined under that lens, provided fuel enough for his enemies. His wife Kitty had been a member of the Communist Party. His brother Frank was a communist. His sister-in-law, too. Oppenheimer himself had been sympathetic in the 1930 seconds, attending meetings, giving donations, associating with people now seen as dangerous. During the Manhattan Project, military security had raised concerns, but General Groves had insisted on keeping Oppenheimer anyway, trusting his brilliance. Now, in a new era of fear, those old associations became sharp weapons. In 1953, Strauss, now head of the Atomic Energy Commission, seized his chance. He orchestrated a review of Oppenheimer's security clearance, the very badge of trust that allowed him to advise the government. Without it, Oppenheimer would be silenced, removed from influence, cut off from the corridors where decisions were made. It was, in effect, a trial without being called one, and it would become one of the most dramatic episodes in the history of American science. The hearing began in April 1954, behind closed doors, in a small, airless room in Washington. 3 judges sat at the table, carefully chosen, none inclined to favor Oppenheimer. The prosecutor was Special Counsel Roger Robb, sharp and relentless, armed with FBI files and Strauss's encouragement. Across the table sat Oppenheimer, thin, tired, his cigarette in hand, his dark eyes weary but steady. He had agreed to face the accusations, though he must have known the odds. Day after day, the questioning unfolded. Oppenheimer's past was laid bare: his friendships, his donations, his conversations, every connection to communists, every hesitation in his career, every decision that might be painted as suspect was dragged into the light. His affair with Jean Tatlock, a woman tied to the Communist Party, was probed. His brother's politics were recited. His own youthful sympathies were catalogued. It was less an inquiry into his loyalty than an excavation of his life, step by step, mistake by mistake. Witnesses came to speak for him and against him. Many scientists testified to his brilliance, to his patriotism, to the fact that without him, the bomb might never have been built. But others, notably Edward Teller, chose a different path. When Teller was asked whether Oppenheimer should continue to advise the government, his answer was cautious but devastating. He said he would feel more secure if Oppenheimer were not in that position. He did not call him a traitor, but the implication hung heavy in the air. The room went quiet. Teller's words struck like a knife. For Oppenheimer, it was a betrayal, the moment that sealed his fate. For Teller, it was a choice that would haunt him. For many of his colleagues never forgave him, and the bitterness lasted for decades. In the end, The board declared Oppenheimer a security risk. His clearance was revoked. He was, in effect, exiled from the world he had helped create. He could still teach, still write, still think, but his voice in the halls of policy was silenced. The man once hailed as the father of the atomic bomb was now cast aside, broken, diminished. The impact was immense, not just for Oppenheimer, but for the entire community of scientists. The message was clear. Dissent was dangerous. To question the rush toward more weapons, to speak too openly of morality, to resist the tide of fear, could cost everything. It was a warning written in the fate of one man, a warning that echoed across laboratories and campuses, shaping the choices of those who followed. Oppenheimer himself carried the wound for the rest of his life. He continued to lecture, to write, to speak in public, but the spark of authority was gone. When he spoke of science and conscience, people still listened, but no longer did presidents or generals come to him for advice. He was haunted too by the ghosts of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, by the knowledge that his leadership had opened the door to destruction. In private moments, he quoted poetry, he reflected on the Bhagavad Gita, the ancient lines that had come to him at Trinity, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Yet even in his fall, Oppenheimer remained a symbol of brilliance, of moral struggle, of the uneasy marriage between science and power. His story was not only about one man but about the choices of a nation, about the dangers of fear, about the cost of building weapons that could end humanity itself. The hydrogen bomb had been built. The arsenals were growing. The Cold War was deepening. But in a small room in Washington, in the spring of 1954, another kind of battle had been fought, and lost the battle for the soul of the scientist who had once stood at the center of it all. And as the doors of that hearing room closed, as Oppenheimer walked away diminished, the bomb remained, larger than any one man, larger than any one nation, a power that no trial could silence. The world moved on, the arms race quickened, and the voice of Oppenheimer faded into history, leaving behind the silence of exile and the echo of questions that would never be fully answered. The story of the bomb had moved from laboratories and deserts into hearing rooms and courtrooms, where reputations were broken and loyalties questioned. Oppenheimer had fallen, stripped of his voice, and yet the bomb itself remained, expanding, multiplying, spreading its shadow across the world. By the mid-1950s, the arsenals of both America and the Soviet Union were swelling. The hydrogen bomb had been born, and with it came a new and terrible awareness. This was no longer a weapon that could devastate one city, or two, or 10. It was a weapon that could unmake civilization itself. And if the generals and scientists carried their plans in files and their strategies in locked rooms, ordinary people carried something else, the gnawing fear that one bright morning, or one quiet night, everything could end in a flash. It was a strange kind of fear, both constant and muffled, whispered in classrooms, on television, in family conversations, and in the way cities planned their neighborhoods. To live in America in the 1950s was to live in the age of civil defense, a vast attempt not merely to prepare for nuclear war, but to tame the very idea of it, to convince citizens that they could survive what was, in truth, almost unsurvivable. The government knew that fear could paralyze, that terror could break morale as surely as bombs could break buildings. And so they began to teach, to show, to reassure. They made films, short reels played in schools, with calm narrators explaining what to do if the flash came. The most famous was simple, almost childlike: duck and cover. The little cartoon turtle, Bert, pulled his shell over himself as a flash appeared, teaching children that if they just dropped under a desk, they too might be safe. The logic was thin, but the rhythm of the message was steady, repeated until it became a kind of lullaby. Duck, cover, wait, survive. For children who had no choice but to trust the adults around them, it was enough to quiet the questions for a while. And yet, beneath the surface, unease lingered. Could a wooden desk really stop the fire of the sun? Could a school hallway protect against a shock wave strong enough to tear steel apart? The questions did not always find answers, but the rituals continued, for rituals have power even when their foundations are fragile. Civil defense was not only about classrooms. It spread into neighborhoods, into living rooms, into backyards. The idea of the fallout shelter took hold, a place where a family could retreat if the bombs began to fall. Pamphlets showed neat basements stocked with canned goods, water barrels, batteries, and radios. Walls were thick, concrete was poured, doors reinforced. Some families built shelters in their yards, burying steel cylinders or digging underground rooms. Others bought prefabricated kits, complete with filtered air systems and sanitation units. To own a shelter was to feel a fragile measure of control, a small island of safety in a sea of dread. Magazines advertised them as if they were another appliance, like a new refrigerator or washing machine. Civil defense officials toured the country, explaining how many inches of concrete were needed, how long food supplies should last, how many gallons of water a family of 4 would require for 2 weeks. To prepare was patriotic. To plan was responsible. And to imagine survival was, in some ways, to imagine hope. But not everyone believed. Many scoffed. Some refused. Critics asked, what kind of life would be lived after the blast? What kind of world would be waiting outside the heavy door? Was survival worth it if the cities were ash, if neighbors were gone, if the landscape was poisoned? These questions hung heavy, but civil defense pressed forward, determined to build not just shelters but a culture of readiness. The military, too, conducted tests, not only of bombs but of their effects on ordinary life. In the Nevada desert, small towns were built, rows of houses with white picket fences, with furniture inside, with mannequins posed around kitchen tables. Cars were parked in driveways, curtains hung in windows. Then a bomb was detonated. Cameras rolled as shock waves tore through the streets. Flames swept across walls. Mannequins melted into twisted figures. The films were shown to the public, part cautionary tale, part grim reassurance. The message was that destruction was real, but with the right precautions, with strong basements and clean yards, perhaps survival was possible. Civil defense even reached into the language of the everyday. Pamphlets advised not to let clutter pile up, for trash could ignite in a blast. Keep your house painted, keep your lawn trimmed, keep your pantry full. Cleanliness was not just about pride but about survival. A tidy home, it was said, might resist the fire, while a messy one would fuel the flames. In this way, even the smallest habits became linked to the great shadow of the bomb. Schools continued to drill, not only duck and cover, but evacuation. Buses lined up, routes mapped out, children herded into practice runs as if a bomb would wait politely for the bell. Cities considered how to move millions in a few hours, how to clear highways, how to guide citizens to safety. In reality, such plans were almost impossible, but to try was to show resolve. And in those years, resolve mattered as much as practicality. The doomsday clock, created by the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, ticked closer to midnight. Each shift of its hands was reported in newspapers, a strange symbol of how near or far the world stood from disaster. People read about it, then return to their daily lives, to jobs, to television, to Sunday picnics. This was the paradox of the age. Fear was everywhere, and yet life went on. People married, raised children, bought new cars, painted their fences. The shadow of the bomb was vast, but beneath it, the routines of ordinary life continued, as if denial itself was a kind of shield. For the government, civil defense was also diplomacy. To show that America was prepared, that its people could survive, was to show strength to the Soviet Union. If the enemy believed that nuclear attack would not break the nation, then deterrence was stronger. Civil defense was, in this way, not just about safety, but about strategy, part of the chess game of the Cold War. And yet, deep down, many knew the truth. The hydrogen bomb was not a weapon to be survived. Its fireball was a sun on earth, its shockwave a hurricane of steel and stone, its fallout a poison drifting on the wind. The shelters were fragile, the drills symbolic. What mattered most was not the shelters but the arsenals, not the drills but the decisions made in hidden rooms. The fate of millions hung not on desks or basements, but on the caution of leaders, on the balance of fear, on the fragile hope that deterrence would hold. Still, the rituals of civil defense had their effect. They gave people a sense, however thin, that they were not helpless. They gave children something to do with their fear, a set of steps to follow, a rhyme to repeat. They gave parents the illusion that they could protect their families, that they had not surrendered entirely to fate. Illusion, perhaps, but illusions can carry people through long nights. And so the age of fear was also the age of pretending, of building shelters and stocking food, of ducking under desks, of believing that survival was possible. It was a time when science had reached into the heart of the atom, but ordinary people reached for something simpler, for hope, for reassurance, for the belief that life could go on, even in the shadow of fire. The bomb had changed the world forever, and now it was changing the rhythms of daily life. In every classroom, in every basement, in every whispered conversation about what might come, the presence of the bomb was felt. And as the arsenals grew, as the tests thundered across deserts and oceans, the bomb, the culture of civil defense, became both shield and mirror. A shield against despair, a mirror of the fear that lay just beneath the surface. The mushroom cloud had risen, and it would not be forgotten. The world had entered a new chapter, one where survival itself became a ritual, a practice, a prayer, and beneath the quiet streets, behind the painted doors, families waited, hoping that the plans they were taught would never be needed, praying that the shelter doors would never have to close. By the mid-1950s, the rituals of civil defense had settled into daily life. Families stocked basements, children ducked under desks, and newspapers printed the hands of the doomsday clock. But behind the illusions of preparedness, something far more powerful than duck and cover was taking shape. A new weapon was being imagined, argued over, fought for, and finally brought into existence. It was not merely another step beyond the atomic bomb. It was a leap into something almost cosmic. It was the hydrogen bomb, the super, a weapon born of fire, deeper and more ancient than anything that had ever been summoned by human hands. The idea had hovered in the minds of physicists since the first days of fission. If splitting the nucleus of uranium released such energy, what might happen if one could trigger the very process that fueled the sun itself? That was fusion, the joining together of light nuclei, hydrogen into helium, unleashing energy without limit. It was Einstein's equation magnified. Not kilograms of mass becoming energy, but the very forces that burned at the heart of stars. Edward Teller, a Hungarian-born physicist with piercing eyes and a restless imagination, became its most passionate advocate. Teller was relentless. For him, the atomic bomb was only the beginning. The true destiny of physics, he believed, was not in fission but in fusion, in building a bomb with no theoretical limit, a weapon so powerful that it could shatter entire nations in one flash. He called it the super. Others called it madness. Robert Oppenheimer, by then famous and burdened with the title Father of the Atomic Bomb, opposed a crash program. He saw in Teller's vision something reckless, something beyond the fragile balance the world had just begun to navigate. Oppenheimer and many of his colleagues argued that to pursue such a weapon would be to step onto a path with no return. They believed restraint was possible, that America might hold the high ground by refusing to take the next step. Perhaps, they hoped, the Soviets would not rush to build a weapon that defied reason itself. But restraint was fragile, and fear was stronger. In 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb. The desert monopoly of the United States was over. The balance had shifted overnight. Panic surged through Washington. If they could build one, they could build many. If they could build many, they could build the next. And so the question of the hydrogen bomb was no longer theoretical. It was urgent. Committees formed, scientists debated, generals demanded. Teller argued passionately that to stop now would be suicidal, that to hesitate was to hand victory to the Soviets. Others insisted the weapon would be immoral, destabilizing, catastrophic in its implications. The debate raged, not only in scientific journals, but in the corridors of power. In the end, the decision fell, as it always did, to the president. Harry Truman, a man of blunt words and firm decisions, faced the choice in January 1950. The Soviets had the bomb. The Korean War was erupting. Communist expansion seemed relentless, and the world trembled in the new balance of terror. Truman announced his decision simply: the United States would proceed with the hydrogen bomb. There was no celebration, no dramatic flourish, just a quiet, heavy step forward into the unknown. Work began at once. The challenge was staggering. Unlike fission, which could be managed with uranium or plutonium, fusion demanded conditions of unimaginable heat and pressure. It required the building of a miniature star on Earth. To make hydrogen nuclei fuse, the scientists would have to find a way to ignite them, and only an atomic bomb could provide the necessary spark. The hydrogen bomb would be a bomb within a bomb, a fission trigger unleashing a fusion reaction, magnifying destruction by hundreds, even thousands of times. Los Alamos, once the cradle of the atomic bomb, turned itself to this new task. Teller pressed, calculated, dreamed. Alongside him, Stanislaw Ulam, a quiet Polish mathematician, began to work through the equations. The breakthrough came not from Teller's original vision, but from Ulam's refinements. Instead of simply mixing fission and fusion fuels together, Ulam proposed using the shock wave of a fission bomb to compress and ignite the fusion fuel. Teller seized on the idea, refined it, claimed it, and the Teller-Ulam design became the blueprint for the super. It was as if Prometheus, already punished for stealing fire, had returned to steal the heart of the Sunday in the Pacific. On remote islands, preparations began for the first test. It was called Ivy Mike, scheduled for November 1952. Unlike the compact atomic bombs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Mike was a monster. It was not a bomb in the usual sense, but a towering device. A refrigeration plant the size of a small building, weighing over 70 tons. Liquid hydrogen had to be kept at nearly absolute zero, chilled to impossibility, contained within tanks and pipes. The device stood on Enewetak Atoll, silent, waiting, an ungainly giant, built not to be dropped from a plane, but to prove a principle, that fusion could be harnessed, that a sun could be ignited by human hands. On the 1st of November, 1952, the button was pressed. A flash erupted brighter than anything yet seen. The fireball grew, consuming the air, boiling the sea, clawing at the sky. It was as though the earth itself had been torn open to reveal the heart of Cortes, a star. The yield was 10 megatons, 600 times the bomb that had destroyed Hiroshima. The island of Eligilab vanished entirely, reduced to a crater more than a mile wide. Palm trees vaporized, coral turned to molten glass, waves surged outward carrying the shock. The mushroom cloud rose higher and higher, 30 miles into the stratosphere, vast enough to be seen hundreds of miles away. For the first time, humanity had created a thermonuclear explosion, a hydrogen bomb, the super. News of the test spread quickly, though the details were cloaked in secrecy. What was known was enough. America now possessed a weapon beyond comprehension. For Teller, it was triumph, proof that his vision had been right. For others, it was horror. The atomic bomb had been terrible enough. This was something else, something apocalyptic. And yet, scarcely a year later, in August 1953, the Soviet Union tested its own hydrogen bomb. The arms race had leapt into a new dimension. No longer was it about who had more bombs. It was about who could unleash the greater fire. Megatons replaced kilotons. The destructive power of arsenals multiplied geometrically. The strategies of generals shifted. Deterrence was no longer about the destruction of cities alone, but the potential annihilation of nations, continents, perhaps the planet itself. Civil defense, already fragile, now seemed almost laughable. What basement wall could withstand a fireball that vaporized islands? What canned goods could sustain survivors of fallout spread across oceans? The hydrogen bomb rendered the old reassurances hollow, and yet the rituals continued, because to stop them would have been to admit the truth, that survival was no longer a matter of preparation but of chance. And yet, life went on. The bombs multiplied, but so did suburbs, highways, television shows. The contradiction deepened. The more powerful the weapons became, the more ordinary the routines of life seemed. Beneath the daily comforts, beneath the laughter of children and the hum of new appliances, the great shadow spread wider, invisible, inescapable. The hydrogen bomb had changed the equation forever. Now, humanity lived not only under the threat of destruction, but under the knowledge that such destruction could be total, that civilization itself was fragile before the fire it had summoned. And still the work continued. Designs grew more compact, more efficient. From the giant refrigeration plant of Mike to weapons that could fit in the bay of a bomber, the hydrogen bomb evolved, multiplied, spread across arsenals. Each improvement was hailed as progress, but progress here meant only swifter annihilation. The world had entered a new chapter, not of fear alone but of awe, of wonder twisted into dread. The super had been born, and with it came the realization that humankind now held the power of the stars, the fire of creation itself, turned toward destruction. And so, in the quiet homes where families stocked food and water, in the classrooms where children ducked under desks, in the halls of government where generals planned strategies and scientists argued ethics, the same truth lingered unspoken. The age of the atom had become the age of the sun, and the question was no longer whether we could survive the bomb, but whether we could survive ourselves. By the time the hydrogen bomb was tested and the super became real, Robert Oppenheimer was no longer the young, brilliant professor guiding scientists in the desert. He was older, grayer, burdened by what had been created. Burdened, too, by the weight of fame. He had stood at Los Alamos in 1945, watching the fireball of Trinity rise into the morning sky, and later he had told of words from ancient scripture. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." For years afterward, those words clung to him, not because they summed up what he felt at that exact moment, but because they seemed to describe what history had made of him. He was celebrated, honored, sought after by leaders and journalists. He was also doubted, mistrusted, and eventually betrayed. The Cold War did not stop to honor his genius. It pushed forward, relentless. Teller had triumphed with the super, and in the world of Washington politics, Oppenheimer's caution came to look like weakness, even disloyalty. For a time he advised presidents, sat on committees, guided policy. He was chairman of the General Advisory Committee of the Atomic Energy Commission, speaking with the voice of a sage, weighing science against morality, strategy against survival. But in the tense years of the early 1952s, with the Korean War raging and the Soviets matching America bomb for bomb, doubts about him began to grow. Whispers about his past returned. Whispers that had been quieted during the urgency of the Manhattan Project but had never entirely gone away. His wife had once been a member of the Communist Party. His brother, his sister-in-law, friends from Berkeley, many had been connected to leftist causes in the 1932s, in the years when the Depression had left people searching for answers, and fascism had not yet been fully revealed as the great enemy. Oppenheimer himself had never joined the party, but he had moved among those who did, and he had given money, spoken words of sympathy, lent his name to causes. In the feverish climate of McCarthy's America, those things were enough to be dangerous, and there were those who wanted him destroyed. Chief among them was Louis Strauss, a self-made millionaire, a shoe salesman turned banker, who had risen into the circles of power and nursed grudges like coals kept alive under ashes. Strauss had once been humiliated by Oppenheimer in a public hearing when Oppenheimer dismissed his fears about exporting isotopes, answering with a sharp wit that left Strauss embarrassed. It was not the only wound, but it was the one that festered. Strauss believed Oppenheimer had opposed the crash program for the hydrogen bomb, that he had slowed progress, that he had stood in the way of what men like Teller and Strauss believed was the true path to safety. Overwhelming force. So, Strauss watched and waited, and when he rose to become chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, he began to gather threads into a noose. He fed suspicions, whispered doubts, collected files from the FBI, which, under J. Edgar Hoover, was always eager to provide wiretaps and transcripts. Oppenheimer's phone was tapped. His conversations were monitored, his friendships dissected, and when the time was right, Strauss struck. In 1954, Oppenheimer was summoned to a hearing to decide whether he should keep his security clearance. It was not a trial in the ordinary sense. It was not about crimes proved beyond doubt. It was about suspicion, about loyalty, about whether the man who had built the bomb could still be trusted with secrets in an age of terror. The room where it was held was small, windowless, designed to contain not only people but also the weight of judgment. Oppenheimer came, dignified, calm, smoking endlessly, speaking carefully. He faced questions that cut into his past. Questions about his wife, his brother, his friends, his donations, his political sympathies. He admitted some, denied others, tried to explain the complexity of those years. He had been naive. He had been sympathetic. But he had not been a spy. He had devoted himself to the bomb, to the country, to victory. Yet in the climate of 1954, those explanations carried little weight. The prosecutors laid out their case, page after page of old connections, old meetings, old rumors. They spoke of Klaus Fuchs, who had betrayed secrets to the Soviets from within Los Alamos. They hinted, though they had no proof, that Oppenheimer might have been careless, that he might have let slip something he should not have. They reminded the panel that Oppenheimer had opposed the hydrogen bomb, that he had stood against what America had now embraced as its shield and sword. And then came the most cutting moment, the testimony of Edward Teller himself. Teller, who had worked under Oppenheimer at Los Alamos, who had argued with him, who had pursued his dream of the super against Oppenheimer's doubts, came before the panel. He was asked, "Do you believe Oppenheimer is a security risk?" Teller did not say yes directly. He was cleverer than that. He said, "I would feel more secure if public matters would rest in other hands." It was enough. It was a blade slipped between ribs, a betrayal dressed in careful words, but betrayal nonetheless. The scientists who had worked with Teller never forgave him. For the rest of his life, he carried the reputation of the man who had turned on Oppenheimer. Day after day, the hearing went on. Oppenheimer sat through it all, thinner, more tired, shrinking under the weight of accusation. Witnesses came, some defending, some attacking, some cautious, some bitter. The FBI provided transcripts of private conversations, feeding suspicion. The panel listened, judged, measured not only facts but impressions, not only deeds but shadows. In the end, they voted to strip him of his clearance. The man who had built the bomb, who had guided the minds of Los Alamos, who had given America its most powerful weapon, was cast aside as a risk, a liability, an outsider. The decision was devastating. Oppenheimer was not jailed, not ruined in the financial sense. He still had his lectures, his books, his mind. But his role in the center of power was over. He was cut off from the secrets he had once commanded, excluded from the councils where policy was made. For a man who had given himself to the service of the nation, it was a humiliation, a spiritual death. He withdrew, retreating to his home in Princeton, walking the paths near the Institute for Advanced Study, where he was still director, but carrying within him a wound that never healed. To some, the hearing was justice, proof that America would tolerate no hint of contentions, divided loyalty. To others, it was a witch hunt, a petty revenge carried out under the cloak of national security. To Oppenheimer's friends, it was tragedy, the destruction of a man who had given so much, by those who feared him, or envied him, or simply needed a scapegoat in a dangerous age. The story of Oppenheimer on trial was not just the story of one man, it was the story of a nation caught in fear, a nation that had summoned fire and then turned on the man who had held the torch. It was the story of how suspicion corrodes trust, how politics devours genius, how gratitude turns to betrayal. And it left behind a bitter lesson, that those who create the tools of power may not be the ones allowed to guide their use. In the years after, Oppenheimer spoke less. He gave lectures, elegant, thoughtful, often poetic. He traveled, accepted honors, though some were shadowed by controversy. In 1963, President Lyndon Johnson presented him with the Enrico Fermi Award, a kind of official rehabilitation, though by then Oppenheimer was a dying man, his health eroded by cancer, his spirit long scarred. He accepted, but the wound remained. For the scientists who had once followed him to Los Alamos, the trial was a turning point. It showed them that science and politics could never be separated, that to create weapons was to step into the storm of power, suspicion, ideology. Some retreated to pure research, some embraced the military world, some protested, some resigned. But none could forget what had been done to Oppenheimer. And as the bombs grew larger, as the stockpiles multiplied, as the arms race accelerated, the absence of Oppenheimer's voice was felt more keenly. He had been cautious, hesitant, mindful of consequences. Without him, the momentum toward bigger, faster, deadlier weapons rolled on unchecked. Teller became celebrated, Strauss wielded power, and the hydrogen bomb became the centerpiece of strategy. But in the quiet of Princeton, a thin, weary man carried the weight of having unleashed the atom and then been cast aside by those he had served. Oppenheimer's trial was not about guilt or innocence. It was about fear. It was about a nation that had entered a new age of power and did not know how to trust those who had opened the door. It was about how easily suspicion could undo loyalty, how easily politics could erase gratitude. And it was about how the fire that had been stolen in the desert could burn not only enemies abroad, but also the hearts of those at home. And so, as America stood at the threshold of thermonuclear war, with bombers in the sky and missiles on the drawing board, the man who had once led them into the atomic age walked alone, carrying the knowledge of what had been made, carrying the silence of exile, carrying the strange destiny of a man who had given his country the ultimate weapon and received in return the cold judgment of mistrust. In the years after the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and as the Cold War deepened, the United States faced a strange dilemma. It had unleashed the most powerful weapon in human history, a force capable of annihilating entire cities in a single flash of light. And yet it still needed to reassure its citizens that life could go on, that survival was possible, that ordinary people could find safety in a world now shadowed by mushroom clouds. Out of this paradox was born the vast machinery of civil defense, a campaign that was at once practical, psychological, and, in many ways, deeply illusory. The bomb had introduced not just new military strategies, but also new fears. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, when newsreels showed film of atomic tests and headlines warned of Soviet progress toward their own bomb, Americans could no longer think of war as something that happened far away, on distant battlefields. Suddenly, every city was a target, every suburb, a potential ground zero. School children in Kansas or Ohio could imagine bombs falling just as surely as soldiers on the front lines once had. The Cold War front line was not a trench or a beach, it was the front yard, the living room, the schoolyard. Government planners understood this shift, and they knew that fear could not simply be ignored. Fear, left unchecked, could erode morale, undermine confidence, weaken the fabric of society. So they tried to channel it, to manage it, to turn terror into discipline. They began producing pamphlets, films, radio programs, and training manuals. They spoke in calm, authoritative tones, urging citizens not to panic, but to prepare. "You can survive," the message repeated again and again. "If you do the right things, if you follow instructions, you can live through an atomic attack." And so, civil defense drills became part of daily life. In classrooms across America, children were taught to duck under their desks at the sound of a siren. "Duck and cover," the phrase went, and it was repeated like a nursery rhyme, accompanied by cartoons of turtles pulling their heads into shells. The image was meant to comfort, to give children a sense of agency, but beneath the surface, it revealed the grim reality that survival was reduced to crouching on the floor, hiding behind thin wood, as if desks could stand between fragile bodies and atomic fire. Families were urged to build shelters. Some were simple basements reinforced with concrete. Others were elaborate underground bunkers, stocked with canned goods, water barrels, and first aid kits. Magazines printed diagrams, showing how to dig, how to reinforce, how to ventilate. Companies sold prefabricated shelters, advertised as if they were just another consumer product, like a refrigerator, a television, or a new car. Salesmen promised peace of mind, security, a safe haven where a family could ride out the storm. The shelters were often presented with a certain cheerfulness, as if they could be multi-purpose spaces. "It can double as a playroom," one advertisement suggested, "or an extra bedroom for guests." The grim shadow of annihilation was softened by the language of convenience. Civil defense films reinforced the same message. In carefully staged tests, mannequins were dressed in department store clothing, placed inside model homes, and then subjected to nuclear blasts. Cameras captured the results. The houses burned, the mannequins melted. But in some cases, with enough distance or a bit of reinforcement, they survived. From these tests, officials drew conclusions that were both practical and misleading. They insisted that good housekeeping could save lives. Keep your yard free of trash and dry wood, paint your home, maintain cleanliness, and you could reduce the risk of fire from the atomic heat wave. Survival became a matter of tidiness, as if sweeping the porch could hold back radiation. Behind these efforts lay a deeper truth. Civil defense was not only about saving lives, it was also about sustaining belief. If people thought there was no chance of survival, if they believed nuclear war meant inevitable death, then the nation's entire strategy of deterrence could crumble. For deterrence to work, people had to believe not only that America could strike back, but that it could endure, that it could take a blow and still stand. Civil defense was theater as much as it was policy. It was a way of showing both citizens and enemies that the country would not collapse in panic. But beneath the surface, doubts lingered. Scientists who understood the true scale of thermonuclear weapons knew that the promises of survival were often hollow. The hydrogen bomb was hundreds of times more powerful than the devices that had destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Fallout would spread across vast areas, invisible and deadly. No basement shelter, no quick dash under a desk, could protect against the slow poisoning of radioactive dust drifting for miles. The illusion of safety was necessary for morale, but the reality was grim. And yet, people tried. They bought supplies, they practiced drills, they hung maps of fallout zones in city halls. Civil defense became part of the Cold War rhythm, woven into the fabric of American life. It created a strange dual existence. On one hand, people went to work, watched television, mowed their lawns, and sent their children to school. On the other, they lived with the knowledge that at any moment sirens could wail, that at any moment the world could end. It was a culture of normalcy layered over dread, a way of living in the shadow of annihilation without collapsing under its weight. The government produced endless films to reinforce this fragile balance. They showed families calmly descending into shelters, mothers opening cans of food, fathers checking radios, children reading books by lantern light. They showed orderly evacuations, civil patrols, and rescue crews moving through rubble. They created a vision of nuclear war not as apocalypse, but as disaster management, like a flood or a hurricane. With preparation, with discipline, with faith in authority, it could be endured. Yet, even as these images circulated, the reality of nuclear tests told another story. In the Pacific, massive detonations sent radioactive fallout drifting across islands, contaminating not only military observers but also unsuspecting fishermen. In Nevada, test blasts coated towns with dust, leaving residents to sweep their porches without knowing that each particle carried unseen danger. Civil defense officials rarely spoke of this, rarely admitted how little protection ordinary citizens would have in a real attack. To acknowledge it openly would be to pierce the illusion, to admit that survival was not simply a matter of painting one's house or crouching under a desk. And so the illusion endured. For children, it meant growing up with sirens and drills, with the knowledge that at any moment the world could be consumed. For parents, it meant quietly wondering whether shelters would truly keep their families safe. For the nation, it meant sustaining a fragile hope in the midst of fear. Civil defense was less about preparing for survival than about preparing minds to accept the unthinkable. In hindsight, it is easy to see the futility, the almost tragic absurdity of those drills and pamphlets. But in the moment, they were necessary. They gave structure to fear. They gave people something to do, some action to take, however small. And sometimes, in the darkest times, action is what keeps despair at bay. The illusion of safety was still safety of a kind, a safety of the mind, which allowed life to continue under the shadow of the bomb. The Cold War years stretched on, and civil defense remained. New shelters were built, new manuals written, new films produced. The doomsday clock moved closer to midnight, pulled back slightly, then crept forward again. And through it all, children ducked under desks, families stocked basements, officials measured fallout, and citizens lived with a paradox, that in a world of unimaginable destruction, hope could be sustained by the simplest gestures, tidy yards, clean houses, painted walls, and the faith that in the face of annihilation, survival was possible. The illusion was fragile, but it was powerful. It allowed a society to function. It allowed the Cold War to remain cold, even as arsenals grew, even as missiles stood ready in their silos. And perhaps that was its true purpose, not to save lives in the moment of fire, but to save lives in the years before, by keeping fear from breaking the spirit of a nation. The atom bomb had been terrible enough. It had flattened cities, ended a world war, and opened a door that humanity could never again close. But almost as soon as it had been built, another question arose. If such a thing was possible, could there be something even greater? Could there be a weapon not merely of fission splitting the atom, but of fusion, forcing atoms to combine, unleashing the very power of the stars? For some, the idea was intoxicating. For others, it was horrifying. And for many of the scientists who had worked so feverishly at Los Alamos, it seemed like an unnecessary temptation, a road that need not be traveled. Yet the world was not guided by science alone. It was guided by politics, by fear, by rivalry, and by the relentless push of history. The Soviet Union's first successful atomic test in 1949 sent shockwaves through Washington. For 4 years, America had lived with a monopoly on nuclear power, its leaders confident that no other nation could threaten them with annihilation. Now that confidence was shattered. A mushroom cloud had risen in Kazakhstan, and the world was once again balanced precariously. If the Soviets could catch up so quickly with the fission bomb, what was to stop them from going further? In this atmosphere of suspicion and fear, the hydrogen bomb became more than a scientific possibility. It became a symbol of resolve, a test of will. Should America push ahead, build the super, as it was sometimes called? Or should it step back, restrain itself, and perhaps set an example for the world by refusing to escalate further? Robert Oppenheimer, once the visionary director of Los Alamos, now served as an advisor. He had seen what the first bombs had done. He had watched the desert flare at Trinity, and he had read the reports from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. For him, the hydrogen bomb seemed a step too far, an opening into a future too dangerous to contemplate. He chaired a committee of scientists who studied the question, debated it, and ultimately recommended against a crash program. Their reasoning was not simply technical, it was moral. If the fission bomb was already enough to destroy cities, why seek something that could destroy entire nations in a single blow? But not everyone agreed. Among those most determined was Edward Teller, the Hungarian-born physicist who had always dreamed bigger, reached further, and demanded more. Teller believed the hydrogen bomb was inevitable, that if the United States did not build it, the Soviets would. To him, hesitation was weakness, and weakness was dangerous. He argued passionately, relentlessly, that the only safe path was to go forward. Into this debate stepped President Harry Truman. He was not a physicist, he was a politician, a leader, and a man responsible for the survival of his nation. He heard the scientists' warnings, but he also heard the generals, the strategists, and the politicians who insisted that America could not afford to fall behind. In January of 1950, his decision was announced. The United States would build a hydrogen bomb. The gamble had begun. In laboratories and test sites, in offices and command centers, the project came to life. The first designs were not elegant weapons, but massive contraptions, more buildings than bombs. To force atoms of hydrogen to fuse, they had to be chilled to unimaginable cold, surrounded by heavy machinery, balanced with delicate precision. The device built for the first test was over 70 tons in weight. It was not something that could be loaded into a bomber or hidden in a silo. It was an experiment, a proof of concept. The test was set for late 1952 on the Pacific atoll of Eniwetok. The device was called Ivy Mike. Engineers built a sprawling installation, complete with refrigeration plants, wiring, and instruments to capture the data. Soldiers cleared the island, evacuated the residents, and prepared cameras and sensors to record what was about to happen. On the morning of November 1st, the countdown began. At 0, the device ignited, and in an instant, the world changed again. A fireball rose, brighter than 1,000 suns, towering higher than the sky itself. The yield was 10 megatons, 600 times more powerful than the bomb that had destroyed Hiroshima. Entire islands were vaporized, leaving only a boiling lagoon. The shock wave traveled for miles, flattening everything in its path. And then came the fallout. Radioactive debris lofted high into the atmosphere, drifting across oceans, circling the globe. For those who had witnessed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the power of Ivy Mike was beyond comprehension. It was not merely a bomb, it was a new scale of destruction, an order of magnitude greater. Where the atomic bomb had threatened cities, the hydrogen bomb threatened civilizations. Where the atomic bomb had given nations the ability to kill hundreds of thousands, the hydrogen bomb gave them the power to kill millions. And yet, only 9 months later, the Soviet Union tested its own hydrogen device. Their version was smaller, more practical, designed not as a stationary experiment, but as a weapon that could be delivered by a bomber. The arms race had leapt forward again. In Washington, strategists tried to adjust. They had spoken of deterrence, of maintaining superiority, of ensuring that no enemy would dare to strike first. But now, with hydrogen bombs on both sides, deterrence meant something far more chilling. It meant the possibility of mutual annihilation. It meant that if war came, it might not merely destroy armies or governments, but the very fabric of human life. Still, the laboratories pressed on. Teller and his colleagues refined the designs, shrinking them, making them more efficient, more deadly. Los Alamos became the heart of the effort, building and testing, producing weapons in numbers that grew each year. The arsenal swelled, from a few dozen bombs to hundreds, then thousands, each one more powerful than the last. But along with the weapons came fear. Ordinary people, hearing of the hydrogen bomb, began to grasp what it meant. Civil defense films that had once spoken of ducking under desks or painting houses now seemed hopelessly naive. How could a basement shelter protect against a bomb 1,000 times stronger than Hiroshima? How could a tidy yard shield against fallout, drifting silently across continents? The illusion of safety grew thinner, harder to sustain. And yet, governments persisted. They told their citizens that survival was possible, that preparation was essential, that the nation could endure even this. But in whispers, in private conversations, many admitted the truth, that no shelter, no drill, no plan, could truly withstand the storm that would come if hydrogen bombs ever fell. For scientists, too, the burden was heavy. Some, like Teller, embraced the work, convinced that strength was the only path to peace. Others recoiled, feeling that they had unleashed something they could not control. Robert Oppenheimer himself would become a casualty of this divide. His opposition to the hydrogen bomb turned against him, his loyalty questioned, his reputation destroyed in a storm of suspicion and political revenge. The bomb that had once made him famous now helped bring him down. The hydrogen gamble was not only a technological race, it was a moral trial. Each test, each new design, each new stockpile forced humanity to ask the same question: how much destruction is enough? At what point does security become indistinguishable from madness? And yet the race continued, fueled by fear, by rivalry, by the belief that to fall behind was to die. And so, by the mid-1950s, the world lived under a new shadow, darker than before. The atom bomb had changed history. The hydrogen bomb threatened to end it. The hydrogen bomb had changed the scale of human power. It was not merely larger, it was something altogether different, a weapon of the stars brought down to Earth, capable of burning with the fury of the sun itself. Once it had been proven, once both the United States and the Soviet Union possessed it, the world entered a new phase of the nuclear age, an era not of mere possession, but of confrontation. It was no longer enough to have the bomb. Now it mattered how many, how quickly they could be launched, how effectively they could be hidden or delivered. It mattered how they could be stopped, or if they could be stopped at all. For the first time in human history, two nations faced each other, not simply with armies, but with arsenals that could end civilization in an afternoon. This realization gave birth to a doctrine both terrifying and strangely stabilizing: mutual assured destruction. It was not a phrase born from strategy, but from grim arithmetic. If both sides had enough nuclear weapons to destroy each other completely, then neither side could safely strike first. Any attack would bring retaliation. Retaliation would bring annihilation. And annihilation would leave nothing worth winning. It was a balance of terror, a balance that depended not on courage or diplomacy, but on fear. And yet, paradoxically, it was this very fear that kept the peace. For nearly half a century, the great powers did not dare to fight each other directly. Their weapons were too great, their risks too high. Instead, they fought in shadows, through proxies and allies, in jungles and deserts far from their own homelands. But always, in the background, the mushroom cloud loomed. In the United States, this new reality reshaped everything. The Strategic Air Command (SAC) became the heart of the nation's defense, a fleet of bombers constantly prepared, constantly trained, some even kept in the air at all hours, circling the globe with nuclear bombs in their bellies. Their mission was clear. If the order ever came, they would launch a massive first strike, a Sunday punch, as it was called, intended to cripple the Soviet Union before it could retaliate. But the Soviets prepared too. They built their own bombers, their own missiles, their own fleets of submarines that could lurk unseen beneath the oceans. Slowly, the balance grew more complex, more precarious. No longer was it a matter of one side striking the other. Now it was a dance of detection and deception, of warning systems and radar screens, of seconds and daughter-set minutes that might decide the fate of the world. Leaders on both sides learned to live with this shadow. They learned to talk of deterrence, of credibility, of the delicate art of brinkmanship, pushing an adversary to the edge of disaster without toppling over themselves. They learned to threaten without acting, to bluff without folding, to posture without firing. And yet, behind each speech, behind each parade of missiles or flight of bombers, the terrible truth remained. One miscalculation, one accident, one spark, and the world could end. In homes and schools, this truth seeped into daily life. Children practiced duck and cover drills, crouching under desks as though thin wood could shield them from the fire of the Sunday. Families built fallout shelters in their basements or backyards, stocking them with canned goods, water, and radios. Civil defense films spoke of survival, of resilience, of the need to be prepared. Yet, beneath the calm instructions lay an unspoken dread that no shelter, no preparation, could truly withstand what was coming if the bombs ever fell. The idea of survival became almost a ritual, a way of coping with the unthinkable. To believe that one could endure was to make the threat bearable. But in quiet moments, in honest conversations, many admitted that they did not believe it. They knew that if the missiles flew, there would be no hiding, no escaping. The end would be sudden, and it would be everywhere. For the scientists who had begun this journey in the deserts of New Mexico, the transformation was profound. What had started as a desperate race to stop Hitler, what had seemed a necessary evil to end a terrible war, had now become a permanent condition of human existence. Their work, their discoveries, had reshaped the world. Some felt pride. Others felt regret. Many felt both at once, a tangled knot of accomplishment and sorrow. Robert Oppenheimer, stripped of his security clearance, became a kind of ghost in this new age. He lectured, he wrote, he reflected, but he no longer held the ear of presidents or generals. His warnings about the hydrogen bomb had been ignored, his doubts turned into accusations. And yet, his words lingered, carried by those who remembered his brilliance, his eloquence, his haunting remark after Trinity, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Edward Teller, by contrast, embraced his role as father of the hydrogen bomb. He advised presidents, pushed for new weapons, new defenses, new technologies. His vision was always forward, always toward the next step, whether it was a bigger bomb or a system to stop the bombs of others. He became a champion of ideas like missile defense, the dream that a shield could be built to protect against the sword. But even as he pushed forward, he was a divisive figure, admired by some, distrusted by many, remembered always for the role he played in Oppenheimer's downfall. The 1,950 seconds and 1,960 seconds became decades of testing, of demonstration, of proving again and again the terrible power of these weapons. Bombs were detonated on Pacific islands, in deserts, under the sea, high in the atmosphere. Each test produced clouds of fallout that drifted across the globe, silent reminders that the Earth itself was being poisoned by humanity's creations. Islanders were displaced, sailors and soldiers exposed, civilians downwind unknowingly contaminated. And yet, the tests continued, driven by the need to perfect, to measure, to compete. The Soviets, too, tested their might. In 1961, they detonated the Tsar Bomba, a device so large, so monstrous, that it seemed like a challenge to the very notion of sanity. 50 megatons, a fireball that scarred the atmosphere, a shock wave that circled the Earth. It was not a weapon of war, but a symbol, a message to the world. We, too, can wield the fire of the Sunday. In this world of arsenals and doctrines, of sack bombers and Soviet missiles, the strategy of survival became paradoxical. The only way to disturb a sack, ensure safety, was to be able to destroy utterly. The only way to prevent war was to prepare for the end of all wars. This was the logic of mutual assured destruction, the grim arithmetic that underpinned the Cold War. And so, leaders played their games of brinkmanship, pushing and pulling, threatening and retreating, always careful, always cautious, yet always risking everything. The Cuban Missile Crisis would become the most famous of these moments, a week when the world truly held its breath, when the line between peace and annihilation grew so thin that it nearly vanished. But even before Cuba, there were incidents, misunderstandings, false alarms that could have spiraled into catastrophe. Each close call reminded those who paid attention how fragile the balance truly was. Machines could fail, radars could misread, men could panic, and yet, somehow, through luck, or prudence, or sheer human instinct, disaster was always averted barely. For those who lived through it, the tension became part of life. The threat of annihilation was always present, but always distant, like a storm on the horizon that never quite broke. People married, raised children, built careers, even as they knew that, at any moment, everything could end. It was a strange way to live, suspended between normalcy and nightmare, between ordinary days and the possibility of no tomorrow. The bomb had begun as an idea in the minds of scientists, a scribble on a blackboard, a letter to a president. It had become a weapon, then an arsenal, then a strategy, then a way of life. By the 1960 seconds, it was not only a tool of war, but the very structure of the Cold War itself, the invisible wall that kept the superpowers from open conflict, even as it held the entire world hostage. Brinkmanship was not a policy written in documents, but a practice lived in moments of crisis, in the calm voices of presidents on the radio, in the steely gaze of premiers on parade, in the quiet calculations of generals in command centers. It was a performance of strength, of determination, of will. But behind it lay the simple, terrifying truth that all of it rested on the hope that no one would ever make the final choice to use what they had built. And so, humanity lived under the shadow of annihilation, a shadow cast not by nature or by fate, but by its own genius, its own ambition, its own fear. The balance of terror held, and the world endured, but always, always, at the edge of the abyss. The Manhattan Project began in secrecy, in urgency, in fear. It began with whispers in European laboratories, with discoveries scribbled in notebooks, with letters written by physicists who feared that Hitler's Germany might unleash a weapon the world had never known. It grew into a project of unimaginable scale, drawing upon the talents of thousands, consuming billions of dollars, reshaping entire landscapes. From the forests of Tennessee to the mesas of New Mexico, from the rivers of Washington state to the deserts of Nevada, it built a hidden world of reactors, laboratories, and secret cities. It ended, or seemed to end, in the blinding light over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, in the mushroom clouds that rose like pillars of judgment over a war-weary earth. But the true story of the Manhattan Project did not end in August 1945. It did not end with Japan's surrender, nor with the cheers of soldiers coming home, nor with the parades that marked the end of a global war. It did not end when Robert Oppenheimer walked away from Los Alamos, nor when Leslie Groves delivered his final reports, nor even when the Atomic Energy Commission assumed control. The story continued, stretching across decades, shaping the very fabric of the modern world. The project had unleashed not only a weapon, but a condition of existence, a shadow under which all humanity would live. In the immediate years after the war, the bomb was celebrated as a triumph. Newspapers hailed it as the invention that had ended the conflict, that had saved lives by preventing an invasion, that had proven the genius of American science and industry. The men and women who had worked in secrecy found themselves part of a legend, their efforts woven into the fabric of national pride. And yet, even in those first moments of triumph, there was unease. Oppenheimer himself spoke of blood on his hands. Other scientists, like Leo Szilard, warned of a future where the weapon would multiply, where nations would arm themselves, where the threat of annihilation would never vanish. Their warnings proved prophetic. The Soviet Union, aided by espionage but driven above all by its own determination, detonated its first atomic bomb in 1949. The monopoly was gone. Soon after, the race for the hydrogen bomb began. Teller and his allies pushed forward, convinced that bigger was better, that the only way to stay ahead was to leap ahead. Others resisted, pleading for restraint, for arms control, for wisdom. But the momentum was unstoppable. By the mid-1950s, both the United States and the Soviet Union possessed hydrogen bombs, devices hundreds of times more powerful than those dropped on Japan. From then on, the Manhattan Project's legacy became inseparable from the Cold War. The laboratories it had created did not close, they expanded. Los Alamos continued to design new weapons. Oak Ridge continued to enrich uranium. Hanford continued to produce plutonium. New laboratories joined them: Livermore, Sandia, Brookhaven, each part of a sprawling complex, dedicated not only to science, but to the machinery of nuclear power. Out of secrecy grew permanence. Out of urgency grew institutions. What had begun as a wartime effort became a permanent state of readiness. And with that readiness came fear. For ordinary people, the bomb was no longer an abstraction. It was a presence in daily life. Children practiced drills in school, crouching under desks as sirens wailed. Families stocked basements with canned food and water, some digging elaborate fallout shelters in their yards. Public service films explained how to survive a nuclear blast, though most knew survival was unlikely. The language of annihilation seeped into lullabies and jokes, into songs and films, into the quiet moments when parents watched their children and wondered what kind of future awaited them. The Cold War turned the Manhattan Project into something larger than science, larger than war. It became a way of life, a backdrop to politics, a constant weight on the shoulders of humanity. Every crisis, every confrontation between East and West carried with it the possibility of escalation, of mushroom clouds, of the end of civilization. Leaders spoke cautiously, calculated carefully, lived with the knowledge that one mistake could mean the end. This was the paradox of the nuclear age. The very weapons that made war unthinkable also made peace fragile. But the legacy was not only fear. Out of the laboratories of the Manhattan Project came advances that touched every corner of modern life. Nuclear medicine, radioisotopes, imaging techniques, cancer treatments, all owed their existence to the reactors first built to produce plutonium. Nuclear power plants promised electricity without smoke, without coal, without oil. Particle accelerators, born from the same scientific traditions, probed the mysteries of matter, deepening our understanding of the universe. The duality of the atom, destruction and discovery, was everywhere. Culturally, too, the bomb left its mark. Writers, artists, filmmakers, and poets wrestled with its meaning. From John Hersey's haunting Hiroshima, to films like Dr. Strangelove and On the Beach, to protest songs and marches, the shadow of the mushroom cloud inspired a flood of reflection. Survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki told their stories, ensuring that the human cost would never be forgotten, even as governments argued over stockpiles and treaties. Their voices, fragile yet insistent, became a moral compass in a world too often guided by strategy alone. The Manhattan Project also reshaped the relationship between science and government. Never before had scientists wielded such influence. Never before had government invested so heavily in research. The project demonstrated what was possible when resources were unlimited, when urgency was absolute, when secrecy was enforced. It became a model for big science, paving the way for future endeavors: the space program, the Human Genome Project, vast collaborations in physics and medicine. Yet it also raised questions about the ethics of secrecy, about the responsibilities of scientists, about the line between discovery and destruction. Over the decades, efforts were made to control the nuclear genie. Treaties were signed: the Partial Test Ban, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, SALT, START. Inspections were carried out, arsenals reduced, safeguards established. Civil society organized marches, protests, campaigns for disarmament. There were moments of hope, moments when it seemed the world might step back from the brink. And yet, the weapons remained. They remained still, silent in their silos, sealed in their submarines, waiting in hangars. The legacy of the Manhattan Project is not only history, it is present, it is future. What, then, is the meaning of this legacy? It is complex, contradictory, impossible to reduce to a single sentence. It is the story of ingenuity, of human brilliance, of the power of science to solve the most daunting challenges. It is the story of fear, of human folly, of the capacity to build weapons that threaten all life. It is the story of triumph and tragedy, of victory and regret, of responsibility that can never be set aside. Perhaps the truest legacy lies in memory. The ruins of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, preserved as monuments. The memoirs of survivors, recorded so their suffering is never forgotten. The museums at Los Alamos and Oak Ridge, where visitors walk through the corridors of Alamos. Secrecy. The ceremonies held each August, candles floating on rivers, bells tolling in the morning air. Memory does not erase what was done, but it can remind. Memory can warn. Memory can teach. And perhaps the legacy lies also in vigilance, in the ongoing effort to ensure that what was unleashed in the 1940 seconds is never again used in anger. Scientists today speak of new technologies, artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, climate engineering, and they look back to the Manhattan Project as a cautionary tale. They see how discovery can outpace ethics, how urgency can overwhelm caution, how power can tempt leaders to gamble. They ask themselves, will we remember the lessons? Will we pause? Will we choose wisely? The Manhattan Project was, in the end, not simply about a weapon. It was about humanity confronting its own capacity to create and to destroy, to dream and to fear, to reach for the stars and to tremble before its own reflection. It was about choice. Always about choice. The choice to pursue the bomb, the choice to use it, the choice to build more, the choice, still unresolved, of what to do with them now. As the years pass, as generations rise, who did not live through Hiroshima, who did not crouch under desks, who did not watch mushroom clouds on television, the challenge is to remember that there was a time when the world first glimpsed its own fragility, to remember that the power to end civilization is still with us, to remember that the story of the Manhattan Project is not ancient history but living legacy. And so, the chapter closes. The scientists are gone. The generals are gone. The presidents who made the choices lie in their graves. But the weapons remain. The memory remains. The lesson remains. Humanity stands still in the shadow of that light, born in the desert of New Mexico, a light brighter than 1,000 suns, a light that showed not only what we can do, but what we must never do again. The Manhattan Project was, and is, a story of fire and of memory. Fire that burned cities. Fire that promised power. Fire that could end the world. And memory that insists we not forget, that insists we reflect, that insists we carry forward the responsibility of knowing. For in the end, the bomb is not only a story of science, or of war, or of politics. It is a story of us, a mirror held up to our species, asking quietly, eternally, what will you choose?